Hey everyone, if you're enjoying my RM audiobooks, don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that hype, and maybe check out my Patreon if you want to support the channel even more. Your support means a lot and helps me keep these coming. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. Universal Dome, Chapter 36, The Mist. Author note, hello again. I'm back with yet another chapter, and this time, our heroes are headed to the mist, and they're going to make some baddies evaporate. Spoilers for both the movie and the book are immediate. Enjoy. I own nothing. P.S. This chapter holds the new record for longest chapter yet. So, you might want to take a bathroom break first or something. Stephanie had been pulling weeds in the garden, doing everything in her power not to worry. An exercise in futility is what her efforts amounted to, and the trembling in her hands had grown steadily worse until she had barely been able to grasp the trowel, and it had shortly after tumbled onto the grass as her reserve shattered. In the back of her mind, she knew that she had to have been overreacting. Last night had been nothing but a freak storm, lightning and winds that had grown to astonishing heights in magnitude as a result of two unnaturally strong fronts colliding. And yet, Stephanie's mind refused to accept that truth entirely. Something about it felt wrong, unnatural, supernatural even, and as much as Stephanie had hated to admit it, perhaps that Zelotes Ms. Carmody had more of an influence on her than she'd thought. David had always told her that the crazy woman had gotten in her head with her tales of divine intervention and conspiracy theories, but Stephanie had always lightheartedly rebuked his jibes, even if she could always feel the underlying seriousness behind his joking manner. Her husband worried about her almost as much as she worried about him, which was certainly saying something, as Stephanie's capacity for love often made her worry unnecessarily, so for him despite knowing how capable he was. She was experiencing an example of such behavior now, and she tried to tell herself that both he and Billy would only be gone for a little while. An hour at most. They'd come back with the groceries that she'd requested, and she'd have lunch waiting for them both when they got here. David would fix up the window like he said he would, and Billy could play where Stephanie could see him. The power company would have their electricity restored in no time, and that night, she would fall asleep with David in her arms, and it was then that she'd fall to her knees and sobbed, all the while still berating herself for doing so in the first place, as crying like this served no purpose. It wasn't like anyone had died. Hell, it wasn't like anyone had even been hurt at all. All that had happened was a freak thunderstorm a night before, strong enough to fell trees and knock out the power, but hardly a disaster by any means. And yet, it stood out to Stephanie, as plain as the numerous fallen trees around her all snapped in half at their trunks by the wind and lightning the night before. It stood out because what if the storm had been just a bit stronger? What if the wind had blown just a little bit harder and the tree that now leaned through the living room window had gone through the floor instead while they were in the basement? What if the roof had collapsed and rubble had trapped them down there without any means of escape? What if? Stephanie shook her head. In the back of her mind, she had wondered if she should have gone with David and Billy, and yes, even that creep Norton into town to pick up supplies. The house now seemed so empty without them, and despite the distant chorus of chainsaws up and down the lake that signaled that the neighbors were still there and cleaning up their own fallen timber, Stephanie felt incredibly alone and more vulnerable by the second. As her thoughts drifted to the lake, Stephanie then remembered the strange fog they'd witnessed earlier that morning building on the water and coming down from the mountains. Compared to the storm, that strange mist had seemed far more unnatural, but David's reassurance that it was simply nothing more than a standard fog bank had temporarily quelled Stephanie's fear. But David was not here now, and her heart began to pound her chest and drown out the distant metallic roaring of the neighbors and their saws. That fog gave her chills the moment she'd laid eyes on it earlier this morning. The thickness of it combined with the fact that it actually appeared to be moving towards their house in spite of the opposing breeze had shocked her to the core as well. And to make matters worse, Stephanie had noticed that the encroaching edge of the fog bank had been straight as a ruler, lacking the natural bulges and pockets and swells that could be seen with a typical mist. The thought of the fog now dominated Stephanie's mind, growing more and more prevalent as soon as her thoughts had turned to it, and try as she might to calm herself and focus once again on the weeding at hand, she couldn't shake the awful feeling in her gut every time she pictured the misty cloud in her mind. Her imagination worked against her in that regard, and she shuddered as an unbidden image appeared in her thoughts of the bank growing closer and closer. Her anxiety eventually grew to a fever pitch, and Stephanie at last dropped the tools in her hands and tried not to run around the back of the house and towards the shoreline. Her sun hat caught the breeze as she moved and fell down on her back, still clinging to her by the neck rope, but Stephanie hardly noticed as the lake came into view, or rather, what little could still be seen. Her worst fears were realized immediately. The mist, still in spite of the light wind in the opposite direction, was growing closer and had only seemed to pick up speed as it rolled across the lake. Its unnaturally straight edge is what terrorized Stephanie the most, and in that moment, the mist almost seemed alive somehow, like it was operating with a will of its own against the natural order of the world. Stephanie noticed then that the lake had grown very quiet now. Eerily so, in fact, as the chainsaws and sounds of neighbors at work ceased entirely, leaving only silence to echo throughout the valley and off the fog bank itself. The edge of the mist was less than 100 yards from her, and Stephanie gasped when she saw that it was moving even faster than before. It would be to the shore where she now stood in less than a minute at this rate. And that thought alone made Stephanie turn on her heel and sprint back to the house as quickly as she could, her irrational fear of what that mist was or what may be within it overriding her senses entirely. With a frantic grunt, Stephanie threw open the rear door of the lake house and hurried inside, slamming the door fiercely and locking it before scrambling to the front door to do the same. She returned to the living room to see if the fog had made it to the shore already when her eyes were drawn to the window, which was still wide open with numerous oak branches sticking into the living room. Stephanie cried out in desperation and fear at the sight, her thoughts immediately fearing the worst if the mist held any form of toxin within, and she began to cry once more as the cloud finally rolled over the shore and reached the house at last. Visibility immediately dropped to less than 5 feet in any direction Stephanie looked, and in her panic, she neglected to hold her breath as small wisps of the fog filtered through the window and into the living room. By the time Stephanie realized her error, she realized she'd been breathing in the gas for nearly half a minute now, and no side effects could be noted. There was a faint, acrid smell seemingly coming from the mist itself, but the smell of the mist could be greatly ignored in favor of the fact that it wasn't poisonous. Stephanie exhaled in shaky relief, then took the time to study the cloud closely through the large living room window. The fog itself was heavy, of that there could be no doubt. The thick blanket of white blotted out even the sun into a dull sliver. The furthest Stephanie could see was the vaguest outline of the stump of the tree that was penetrating through the window and into the living room, but beyond that, she could see nothing amidst the solid state of gray. She stared in a stunned silence out at the fog itself, then frantically rushed to the phone, only to angrily slam it down again when no dial tone greeted her. The storm had not only knocked out their power, but their phone lines as well, and the realization that she was now completely unable to reach anyone without going outside filled her heart with startling dread once more. Stephanie's stomach dropped again as her thoughts immediately went to David and Billy, and a horrid image appeared in her mind of the two of them stranded in their vehicle on the road somewhere, barely able to drive forward without going agonizingly slow. Oh God, what if they hit someone? What if someone hit them? Fresh tears blossomed in the corners of Stephanie's eyes, and she held her arms across her stomach and hunched over in fear over what might have become of her husband and child. The moisture in her eyes clouded her view of the outside even more than the fog did, but her agonizing cry was cut off all the same as her brain caught the slightest twitch of possible movement in the fog. Her eyes blinked rapidly to clear her vision at the sight, and once most of the tears had been hastily swiped away, Stephanie looked wide-eyed out the window once more, her face momentarily losing its sorrow and replacing it with silent anxiety. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing moved out there in the cloudy mist, then Stephanie saw it. She could make out nothing more than a darker blob of gray amidst the lighter shade of the fog, but it was there. Judging from what Stephanie saw, she estimated it to be the size of a small dog, but it was moving not at all how a dog would, especially for how fast it was going. It appeared to be scuttling almost, and Stephanie forced a hand over her mouth to avoid crying out as the small form moved across the ground of the backyard and out of sight, immaterializing back into the fog as soon as it had come. She took a tentative step back, then fell to the floor as a thunderous, booming noise blasted her eardrums. The floor, the house, and even the earth itself shook with the noise, and Stephanie grasped the hardwood beneath her hands for something to hold onto as the earthquake rattled plates and cups in the nearby kitchen. And then, as soon as it began, the shaking and rumbling stopped, and an eerie silence followed in its wake. Stephanie stayed on the floor, worried that the sudden earthquake might have been the first of many, but the ground beneath her remained stationary. After a few more moments of silent anticipation, she shakily rose to her feet and dared to look out of the living room window once more. The mist remained, and she internally slapped herself for thinking that something like an earthquake was going to magically dissipate the strange fog. In the back of her mind, however, Stephanie couldn't fight the inkling that they were connected somehow. Her thoughts were broken as she spied movement in the fog once more. Only this time, multiple blobs of gray moved across her vision instead of just one. Her gas caught in her throat. There weren't just 2 or 3 or even 5. No, there were dozens of them, and they were all scuttling low across the ground back and forth as though they were circling the house. Stephanie took another step backward, then jolted with a scream as a large black object leapt from the ether and landed on the glass of the living room window, its heavy impact sending a web of cracks throughout the thick pane. Spider. That was the first thought that came into Stephanie's terrorized mind. But to call this nightmarish creature a spider would be only half correct. The creature held an appearance that was very similar to a common arachnid, except that it clung to the other side of the glass with nearly twice the amount of legs Stephanie knew spiders to have. Its inky black body cast a stark contrast against the backdrop of the mist, and Stephanie could see thin yellow piping running along its abdomen and terminating at the end of its body. It was also massive. Massive enough to be the amorphous anomaly that she had seen run past before. It was the size of a large dog and at least twice as wide, and Stephanie screamed as the creature took notice of her through the glass with a head full of reddish-purple eyes, each the size of a marble. This wasn't real. It couldn't have been real. This was some horrible dream, and Stephanie was certain that she was going to wake up any second now, safe and warm with her arms wrapped around David, and Billy would be jumping up and down by their bed, excitedly requesting pancakes for breakfast. Yes, that's what this was. Just some nightmare that she'd wake up from NESE. Another spider landed on the glass, causing a new network of cracks to form across the now opaque surface. The cracks twisted and joined with the cracks already previously made by the first spider, and Stephanie heard the glass creak as it struggled to hold the weight of the two gargantuan arachnids. Dream or not, Stephanie was no less terrified, and with all the remaining sanity she could muster, she turned and bolted from the living room and through the kitchen. Sandwiches and lunch were furthest from her mind now, and she clawed open the door to the basement and threw herself inside before turning around and locking it behind her. An idle thought wondered how long the door would hold against a wolf-sized demon spider. Never mind two of the beasts, and Stephanie crushed the thought down as best as she could before turning away from the now locked door and fleeing down the remaining stairs and into the basement proper. Originally designed by David's father when the house had been built, the pragmatic man had seen it to ensure that the basement doubled well as a shelter if need be, meaning that there were no windows. That was a fact that Stephanie now found herself eternally grateful for. But now, no windows combined with no power meant that Stephanie was in complete darkness. The only thing she could see was a small strip of dulled light from under the upstairs door. Her thoughts went to the candles that they'd lit when they'd slept down here last night, and Stephanie fumbled her way forward to where she remembered them to be. Thankfully, the matchbook was still sitting right next to the candles, and with trembling hands, Stephanie pulled one of the small wooden sticks from the pack and struck it firmly against the lighting strip. There was a brief spark as the match attempted to light. Then pitch blackness fell over the basement as the flare failed to catch. Stephanie swore and tried again with more force, and was rewarded this time as the head of the matchstick burst into flame and held. Stephanie took comfort in the sudden light for only a moment, and then held the match quickly to the wick of the first candle. It had previously been lit the night before, and the already used wick eagerly ignited at the flame's touch. The sound of shattering glass upstairs brought Stephanie's hammering heart to a stop. Her breath shuddered to a halt as well, and she remained terror-strickenly still as she listened. After a few moments of nothing, she heard it. Movement. Scuttling, to be specific. There were multiple instances of it, too. The upstairs was now full of them. Too many for Stephanie to accurately guess, but enough that she could hear them from every corner of the basement. Then there was the relatively deafening noise of the taps scuttling on the door at the top of the stairs, and Stephanie clamped a hand over her mouth to keep herself from shrieking in despair. The scuttling stopped for a beat, then started again, growing more faint as the source moved away from the door. The scuttling continued on the floorboards above as the creatures began to explore the house, and Stephanie listened to them for almost half an hour before cradling her lone candle in her hands and sinking slowly onto the bed that she'd shared with David and Billy the night before. Her thoughts went to them, and she immediately regretted it as visions of the two of them swarmed by those demon spiders above flooded her consciousness. The tears came again, and Stephanie buried her face in a pillow to muffle her sobs. She was trapped now. She couldn't leave. The creatures above still continued to move around the floors and walls of her home, though their movements had decreased in frequency as they became acclimated to the space. Now, the slower and methodical sort of scuttling she heard seemed to indicate that they were making themselves at home. They didn't seem to be going anywhere, so that meant neither was she. There were provisions down here, enough to last their family a week if need be, and Stephanie prayed that these monsters would leave or at least be driven away before then. But even if they did, then what? The spiders might leave, but what about the mist? What else lurked in the white fog that defied reason and logic? Certainly the army or the National Guard would come. They had tanks and guns and things that could wipe these creatures out. But how long would that take? Would they even think to come here? Those frantic thoughts and many others filled Stephanie's mind as she sat alone by candlelight in the basement of their once quiet and peaceful home. Overarching all of those thoughts, she wished David were here. He always seemed to make things better. She did everything in her power not to dwell on where he and Billy were now, and furiously reminded herself that she had no clue as to how widespread this horrid mist was. Maybe they were clear of it. Maybe they'd made it far enough that the fog hadn't reached them. Doubts formed immediately in her mind at this, however, doubts that poisoned her mind and made her sink further into herself. For countless hours, Stephanie sat listening to the periodic scuttling of the spiders above. How long she truly spent down there, she did not know. The one clock that sat down in the basement had been electric, leaving her no way to tell the time with the loss of power. She watched as the candle burnt low, and she eventually lit another one when it burned down to its stub. Every so often, tears would come, and Stephanie fell into a rhythm of pressing her face into the pillow until she stopped. She also prayed. She prayed like she'd never prayed before, asking for a sign, a saint, anything that might save the lives of her family. Eventually, Stephanie cried and prayed herself out and fell asleep. No dreams came to her, as she'd exhausted every part of herself that day, meaning that she had no energy left to even dream. How long she slept, Stephanie did not know. But when she awoke, the basement was pitch black again, as the candle had burned itself out during the course of her slumber. For the briefest of moments, she had panicked, forgetting where she was and why it was so dark. She calmed down as the memories slowly returned to her, but they offered no comfort as she was once again reminded of the dire situation she was in. Another candle was lit shortly after, though her actions were slow and unenthusiastic as the cold weight of futility began to settle on her mind. She sat in silence for a little while before daring to move slowly around the basement, looking over the various items of furniture and clothing that had been stored down there as items that were not worthless enough to sell or give away, but still not important enough to keep upstairs where they'd be more easily accessible. Stephanie might have once smirked at the irony that these were now the only things she had access to, but she was too tired for humor. It was the kind of fatigue that sleep did not fix. She slept again after a while, though dreams continued to elude her. She was too tired for those anyway. When she awoke once more, the third candle had burned itself out. She barely found the motivation to light a fourth. How long had she been down here now? A few hours? A day? A week? How much longer would she have to wait? Darkened thoughts came to her again, and this time, Stephanie did not have the mental strength to banish them. David, Billy, what were the odds they were still alive? Had they made it to somewhere safe before the mist had come? And even if they had, how long before they were rescued, if at all? How long before they told their rescuers where she was? No one was coming. The thought had been so sudden, and yet it was the loudest of all in her mind. It had popped into her head of its own volition, and Stephanie offered up a paltry resistance against it, but it was like her mind had already accepted it as an undeniable fact. No one was coming, and even if they did, they wouldn't save her. There seemed to be nearly dozens of those monstrous spiders above, and any attempt to rescue her would surely end in death at the hands of those creatures. Stephanie felt herself grow numb as her mind settled on its conclusion. There was no point in denying it now. This house would be her tomb. Whether she died of starvation in a pointless attempt to survive as long as possible, or whether she was eaten alive by the creatures waiting upstairs, it made little difference. The outcome was the same. Her thoughts then turned to consider the inevitability of it, and how despite the fact that her death was coming anyway, she still had some power over her fate. How to meet it. In the dull orange glow from the candle, Stephanie looked up the stairs to the door at the top. The sliver of gray still permeated from underneath the portal, meaning that it was daytime at least. Whether it was the same day as when she'd first come down here or 3 days later, Stephanie did not know. Her mind dwelt on how much longer she had in terms of food. There was still plenty stored away in the pantry built for such a purpose, and though she was no survivalist, Stephanie figured she could last at least another 2 weeks down here. Was that enough time to be rescued? Stephanie was doubtful, especially if this mist covered more than just the lake. Perhaps it went even further than the state line, maybe even the entire eastern seaboard. No one was coming. She'd already accepted that as fact, which easily defeated the argument of staying down here and wasting away until the food ran out. That left only one option. She took a step towards the stairs, her mind slipping into a haze that could be considered akin to the fog outside. It was the only way she could see this through. Dissociation was what she needed to give her the strength to do this. David, Billy, I'm so sorry. The tears came again, but they went unnoticed as she reached the foot of the stairs. In a trance, Stephanie laid her hands out onto the railings, her head tilting up to look at the orange-bathed door and the sliver of gray light slipping through the bottom. Please forgive me. Perhaps that was the light at the end of the tunnel. Seeing it now, Stephanie felt closer to God than she'd ever had, regardless of the fact that all of this was likely a result of his abandonment of them. She sent one last prayer up to beg for forgiveness, doubtful that anyone was listening now. No one is there. No one is coming. At least she could be sure of two things now. Her foot had just climbed the first stair when a loud commotion came from above. It had sounded like a heavy crash, and Stephanie could hear the splintering of wood over the sudden, surprised movement of the spiders upstairs. There was a brief pause. Then a deep bark rumbled throughout the house, sounding like something close to the bark of a dog but deeper and more warped, as if it had been twisted in an unnatural imitation of itself. It carried far more weight as well, the strength of it evident in the way that it still echoed throughout the house even though the bark itself lasted only a split second. The bark was followed by a growl emanating from the same source, and it carried the same distortion and power as the bark that preceded it. Stephanie heard the screech of a few of the spiders in response, but they sounded so insignificant now compared to whatever new creature had just broken in. Then, all hell broke loose as something large and heavy began aggressively moving about the upstairs. The sound of the large spiders running this way, and that overlapped into a continuous scraping. But the pounding of the larger creature permeated through the sea of noise, and periodically, Stephanie heard the dull thud as it crashed into the walls and furniture. The spiders screeched even louder, and even though Stephanie had no familiarity with this form of arachnid, she still knew what cries of pain sounded like. She remained still as the carnage upstairs continued, and after only another minute or so, the overarching scuttling began to falter and break, indicating that fewer and fewer spiders were active and moving with each passing second. The snarls of the larger beast grew more and more dominating as a result. A deafening blast was then heard, and Stephanie immediately recognized it as the discharge of a firearm, and a powerful one at that. The larger beast had not ceased its assault by any means, but it was obvious that something new had entered the fray as well. The firearm discharged again, and then 5 times more before silence finally fell upstairs. There was no more scuttling to be heard, and Stephanie stood frozen with her foot still perched on the bottom stair as her ears strained to make out any form of movement on the floor above. Only ringing reached her ears at first, courtesy of the gunfire. Then the heavy thud of footsteps began, combined with a lighter trotting of something four-legged as well. Stephanie turned to look at the point on the ceiling where the footsteps were just above, following the heavy footfalls as they worked their way across the living room and into the kitchen, steadily growing louder all the time. The steps were slow and controlled, giving the impression that whoever or whatever was making them carried an assurance and relative calmness that Stephanie certainly did not share. The footsteps continued until they stopped right in front of the door to the basement, and Stephanie jumped when something on the other side rapped 3 slow and distinct knocks on the wood. The door shuddered with each knock, as if it was having trouble withstanding the force used to knock against it. But Stephanie remained still, her mind blank, and unable to come to a decision as to whether she should answer. Whatever was up there obviously knew that she was down here, but Stephanie had no indication as to if it was friendly or not. It sounded just now as though it had killed the spiders, but that did not mean that it held her best interests. What if? "We mean you no harm," came a sudden cold and metallically pleasant voice from behind the door. "We wish only to provide assistance. What will keep them at bay? The rock will not hide them. The dead tree offers no shelter. Expiation. What will end it? Let me hear it. Expiation. Say it again, like you mean it. Expiation." Ollie sighed, next to David as they all looked on at the spectacle. "Welcome to Sesame Street," he said in a low, sarcastic voice, so that only David and the few others could hear from where they stood apart from the main group. "Today's word is expiation." David's eyes wandered across the gathering that had built in the meat section, staring with defeat at the amount of followers Mrs. Carmody had amassed. Those that weren't enthusiastically participating in her sermon still listened raptly to her every word, seemingly taking in sustenance from her preaches of deliverance and salvation from the nightmare by atoning for their sins. His eyes stopped when he saw Jim standing at the front of the congregation, more involved with the chants than anyone else. "That boy hasn't been right since the pharmacy," came Dan's weathered voice from beside him. His mind just snapped. In a way, David understood why. Jim had seen the horrors of the mist, just the same as they all had ever since they'd found themselves trapped inside the store. Everything that they thought existed only in fairy tales and nightmares had become real in a matter of minutes, shaking the foundation of everyone's belief in what was and wasn't possible. And that MP, the one they discovered when they tried to run to the pharmacy for supplies. What those creatures had done to him, that had shaken all of them to the core, those that had seen it. David, despite the terror he felt, tried to remain strong and put on a brave face despite the despair he felt inside himself. He had to be strong for Billy, who was sitting idly just down the produce aisle from him, and for Stephanie. David's thoughts turned to her for what seemed like the millionth time now over the last day and a half. He hoped and prayed with everything he had that she was all right. She was tough, and she had enough food to survive, and his only hope was that she had been able to make it inside before the mist had fallen. It hasn't even been 2 days, Amanda muttered from his left shoulder. Not even 2 days for them to lose their minds. The older man, Ambrose, grunted from where he stood at the back of their small group of outcasts. I'm not spending the rest of my life here, the grizzled man said resolutely. Ollie looked over at all of them, then spoke softly so that no one outside the group could hear. I could quietly gather up some bags of supplies, Ollie said, his eyes already moving up and down the aisles, looking like he was already sorting out what they'd need if they were to try and survive outside the store. I can hide them up by one of the checks stands by the door. It was your idea, David, Dan said, the 7 of them unwittingly turning to make a small huddle of discussion. It's your vehicle, so it's your call. David remembered. He remembered how he'd suggested that a few of them that still had their sanity could gather some supplies and try for his vehicle located only 20 feet away in the parking lot. They might not even make it 2 feet past the doors, let alone 20, but they had to try something, anything rather than sit here and wait for something else to come in and kill them. I'd rather die out there, trying, Amanda said, echoing his thoughts. I don't want to die here, simply waiting. A look across the others' faces showed that they shared in Amanda's mindset, and David found himself slowly nodding along with them. Anything if it meant he could escape from Mrs. Carmody's delusional ranting and maybe see Steph again. The soldiers? Ollie asked, his face scrunching up in confusion. What's that going to do? You heard what that MP said at the pharmacy, Ollie. They know something. David, I don't even know what he was saying. The situation was insane. He said he was sorry, Irene said, the older woman's eyes flitting contemplatively. Wasn't that the word he used? Sorry. That's right, Dan agreed with a nod. He said it was their fault. The mist, the monsters, everything. What did he mean by that? That's what we're going to find out, David replied. Come on. He turned and led the group away from the congregation, leaving Mrs. Carmody and her followers to continue their shouts of delivery and sacrifice. The alpha hellhound paced impatiently as both it and the Doomslayer waited for the human behind the door to answer. The hound could smell her quite clearly, as fear left a quite pungent aroma in the air when it was experienced by humans, or at least it did to the hound. It growled annoyedly and tilted its head questioningly to the Doomslayer, curious as to why he refused to open the door himself. The hound fundamentally knew what locks were, but both it and the Doomslayer were more than capable of breaking this door down to come face to face with the human inside, lock or not. Eventually, the hound concluded that the Slayer had opted against destroying the door in order to keep it as a possible future barrier to protect the human inside, if need be. From what the hound had seen of the prey that existed in this world, if something out there really wanted to, they could destroy the door as well. What they possessed in strength, however, they did not possess in intelligence, and the hound doubted the creatures would recognize a door when they saw one, meaning that as long as the door remained closed, they would pass it by without a second thought. So that meant the door had to stay unbroken, though it was becoming more and more difficult to resist the urge to charge through it by the second. An idea then crossed into the hound's mind. It knew how doors worked, so maybe it could open the door from the inside. Without a second thought, the hound summoned its will and warped into the basement with a flash of lightning. Immediately, it came face to face with a startled human female, who shrieked in surprise and horror and scrambled backwards from it. A quick glance around the darkened basement showed the only source of light to be a candle on the bedside table, meaning that the flames on the hound's back brightened the space considerably with its arrival. Shadows danced on the now orangish amber walls, and the hound spared the terrified woman a glance before trotting up the stairs to the door that now separated it and the Doomslayer. A keen glance with its glowing eyes told the hound that there appeared to be no external locking mechanism on the door itself, meaning that its lock must have existed in the handle. Standing up on its hind legs, the hound experimentally took the door handle in its teeth and jolted it slightly. It was rewarded with a sharp click as the lock on the door disengaged, and with a twist of its head and a push with its forelegs, the door slowly opened, revealing the Doomslayer's waiting form on the other side. The hound gave a snort, then turned and trotted back downstairs into the basement, the Doomslayer following its lead and shutting the basement door behind him. Back at the bottom of the stairs, the human female had scrambled to her feet and pressed herself as far away from the two of them as was possible, her terrified eyes looking between the hound and the Slayer as though the two of them were going to attack at any second. There was a brief moment of silence. Then the strange voice that lived in the Slayer's suit spoke to the woman, and though the hound did not understand the words, it deciphered that the voice was doing what it could to reassure her, though it seemed to have minimal effect. The woman asked a question in a stammer, and the strange voice answered almost immediately. The woman asked more questions after that, and the hound began to grow bored as the verbal interaction continued. Looking around the darkened room, the canine gave an experimental sniff in the direction of the food storages that the woman had stacked nearby, but found nothing of interest. It had eaten its fill just a few minutes ago, as the number of arachnids combined with their large forms had been a feast for it. Its stomach was satisfactorily full. A glance back at the woman showed that she seemed to grow a bit more trusting of them as the conversation went on. Then the hound detected frantic enthusiasm in her voice as she began gesturing with her hands and pointing to an arbitrary destination the hound could not see. It looked as though she was requesting something from him now, and the hound tilted its head once more in curiosity of what it was she wanted. The voice gave a final few words of reassurance. Then the Doomslayer turned its attention to the hound, who looked back up at him expectantly. The Slayer gestured lightly towards the woman, and the hound picked up instantly from his body language that he wanted it to stay with her. For how long, the hound did not know, but it felt the spark of indignation appear within its being at being asked to look after this human like she was some young pup. Not in the least when it knew that stronger prey existed out there in the strange fog that enveloped this land. The hound's excitement over hunting powerful prey was quickly being stifled by the Slayer's order to guard the woman, and it gave a grunt, but it relented, yielding to the Slayer's request despite its indignity. Taking a few steps forward, the hellhound sat down on its haunches, locking eyes with the woman as she eyed it distrustingly. The voice spoke to her again, likely explaining that the hound would be staying with her, and she shook her head and made some sort of excuse in response, which was in turn calmly and easily rebuked by the voice. The woman's nervous gaze looked from the Slayer to the hound in desperation, but she seemed to realize quite quickly that she had no say in this matter. It seemed to the hound that she was just as unenthused about the situation as it was, though their newfound common ground did little to improve the hound's agitation at being assigned to guard a single human. This was the first one they'd found alive since arriving in this world, and the hound could smell the familiar aroma of death stemming from the neighboring houses, signifying that there were no other living humans for miles around. They had already been hunted and devoured by the creatures that dwelled in this mist. With seemingly nothing left to say, the Doomslayer gave the hound a small nod and walked back up the stairs, his heavy footfalls growing more and more muffled as he reached the top and crossed the living room to the outside. He had shut the door to the basement before he left, which had made the hound's flaming fur once again the primary source of light within the room. Silence fell save for the light crackling of embers from its hellhide, and before long, the hound eventually laid down completely, consciously diminishing its flames in order not to catch the floor on fire. With the loss of most of its flames, the woman seemed to relax ever so slightly, perhaps reassured now that the alpha looked more akin to a naturally born wolf instead of an apex predator from the dark ether. Tentatively, she moved away from her position in the far corner in the room and took a seat at the foot of the bed, now closer to where the hound lay, but still keeping her distance. The hound watched her as she moved, its ears still listening for any commotion outside now that the Slayer's footfalls had faded into the mist. For some reason, sound was warped by the strange fog outside, making every noise muffled even when in close proximity to the source. The discovery annoyed the hound considerably, so it turned to its sense of smell and was rewarded when it realized that the opposite effect seemed to have occurred for its olfactory organs. Thanks to the strange properties of the mist, its range of smell was now exponentially more sensitive than what it was normally, though its original range was certainly nothing to scoff at either. It raised its head and experimentally sniffed the air, catching a faint whiff of the Slayer's metallic armor as he continued away from their location, likely towards whatever obscure destination the woman had given him. Another sniff revealed the faint remnants of gasoline and exhaust from the human dwellings around the lake, perhaps from one of the numerous gasoline-powered tools humans use from time to time. Judging from the strength and intensity of the smell, the hound estimated the farthest of the smells was almost a dozen miles away, setting a record for the greatest distance the hound had ever picked up a scent from. Standing up, the hound slowly paced around the basement, continuing to test the limits of its newfound super smell. It smelled the strong carrion of the human victims that the mist had taken already. It also smelled the unease and fright of the local animals in the area, those that did not originally stem from mist. Such creatures were woefully underdeveloped compared to the new life that now walked among them, making them all easy prey for the monsters that had spawned. Those that had tried to flee had been hunted and slaughtered, and those that hid shared the same fate, their efforts only delaying the inevitable. A new smell registered on the tip of the hound's nostrils, and it immediately bristled as it recognized it to be a creature of the mist. It was approaching rapidly through the fog, heading directly for their current location. The hound recognized it as exceptionally large, and its strong smell was also indicative of the fact that the creature itself was formidable. The hound let out a low growl, startling the woman and causing her to half rise from the bed she sat on. Her scared human eyes searched the hound questioningly, but the hound paid her little mind. Its focus was on the approaching challenger, and its initial irritation at being left behind by the Slayer quickly faded as it felt the thrill of the hunt well up within it. The flames on its hide flared in response, causing the woman to take a half step back and hold a hand up to shield herself from the light and heat. The hound gave the human a quick glance, then warped out of the basement and into the mist outside, shaking its fur upon its arrival to ensure that its own scent carried through the forest and to the approaching creature. The challenge was accepted with a distant roar and the scent of adrenaline coursing through the new monster's body. The hound felt the thrill soar within itself even more at its response, and it began pacing with anticipation as the creature grew nearer. Its hell hide burned brighter as well, and the resulting blaze evaporated the mist around it, the fog bank seemingly retreating in deference to the life fire that flared from the alpha. The scent of the creature reached its apex, and as if on cue, a large shadowy form coalesced from the mist, slowly stalking forward into the ring of clear visibility that had centered around the hellhound. It was large, significantly larger than the hound, and it walked on 4 powerful legs that ended in sharp claws that looked perfect for climbing steep surfaces or tearing into prey. Further observation showed it to be reptilian in nature, with a smooth pointed head that extended from a rigidly scaled body. A long tail swished back and forth menacingly from its posterior, and a pair of glowing golden eyes with vertical slits for irises studied the hound menacingly. The canine growled as the creature locked eyes with it, and the reptilian monster responded in kind with an aggressive hiss that showcased rows of razor-sharp teeth within a gargantuan mouth. Its slitted eyes narrowed, and its large body began to slither fluidly back and forth as it sized up its foe. With a trained eye developed over time, by hunting all manner of prey, the hound took note of the creature's more dangerous traits. The claws and the teeth were obvious enough, but also noted its scaled body and tail as well. Scaly skin was difficult to find purchase on, which meant the hound would need to exercise extra caution when attempting to bite. The monster's neck was also as thick as its head, meaning a quick kill by snapping the joint was out of the question. Looking now to its tail, the hound noted that the size and length would make for an excellent bludgeon, and it held no doubt that the creature would attempt to use in combat. With initial observations complete, it was easy to see that this monster was well suited for battle and was likely considered to be the top of the food chain among the other creatures that resided within the mist. Unfortunately for it, the hellhound was also at the top of the food chain, and though the monster was sure to be formidable in a fight, the hound could see the inexperience in its eyes. The vertical slits carried a blatant arrogance that suggested the creature was assured of its victory, likely only taking into account its size advantage as the sole determinant of who would survive the ensuing brawl. It did not yet understand that size was not everything, though it would learn that lesson soon enough courtesy of a true apex predator. Planting its feet, the hound's growl crescendoed into a loud bark, and without waiting for the monster to reply, it charged forward, its fangs bared murderously. No, it wasn't me. David struggled to try and reach Jessup, but the angry hands of Mrs. Carmody's mob held him back. Everyone in the store had formed a ring around the soldier, and the private had been forced to his knees as by the now Zelotus Jim. "Private Jessup," Mrs. Carmody said accusingly. "Tell us the truth." I'm just stationed up there," Jessup said from his position on the floor. He held his hands out in an attempt to quell the frenzied glares from the mob around him. But David could see that these people were now beyond reason, and now that there was possibly blame to place, all of the pent-up rage and righteous fury that these people felt was about to be unleashed. "I'm not responsible." "Bullshit," Jim barked from where he stood next to Jessup, fists balled in anticipation in case Jessup tried to rise. "I'm a local," Jessup shouted back. Most of you people know me." Mrs. Carmody stepped forward and wrapped her hand around his throat, choking the words from Jessup's mouth before he could speak again. "You stop your chicken shit prattling now, or I will cut your peeling tongue out, boy. Now tell us." Mrs. Carmody forcefully released him, and David attempted to reach him once again before being forced backward by the mob. "You stay out of this, Drayton," one of the men hissed dangerously. Jessup doubled over and coughed as his airway became clear once again, and the store fell silent save for the low drone of the fluorescent lights above. Okay, he said desperately. "I heard stuff." "Stuff?" Mrs. Carmody said with a sneer. "Yes, we all heard stuff. Like how they thought there were other dimensions, you know? Other worlds around us, and how they wanted to try and make like a window or something. Then maybe they could look through and see what was on the other side." Silence reigned once again, but the air was thick with the weight of what Jessup had just said. Even the prophetic Mrs. Carmody was speechless, her hand held over her mouth in absolute shock. It was a long moment before she finally spoke. "Well, maybe your window turned out to be a door, didn't it?" "No, not mine. The scientists." "Oh yes, the scientists, of course." "Yes, they must have ripped a hole open by accident, and that world came spilling into ours. That's what Donaldson was saying to me right before he killed himself. I didn't understand half of it. That's all I know. I swear." Jessup was crying now, pleading with every ounce of his being for the crowd to listen, but even a blind man could see the vengefulness in their eyes. "It ain't my fault." "Oh," Mrs. Carmody said, throwing her hands up as if all was suddenly made right by his denial. "It ain't his fault. Of course not. Ain't nothing ever anyone's fault. But he denies it. He points the finger." Mrs. Carmody gestured down to Jessup's trembling form. "This Judas in our midst." David attempted to push forward once more, but he was shoved back roughly once again, this time with enough force to almost topple him. "You?" The commotion had been enough to draw Mrs. Carmody's attention, and David felt his skin crawl as she fixed him with vehement eyes. "Don't you know by now, David Drayton? Have you not seen the truth with your own eyes? We are being punished. And for what?" Mrs. Carmody turned back to Jessup and grabbed him by the chin. "For going against God's will. For going against his forbidden rules of old. Walking on the moon. Splitting his atoms. Yes, or messing with his stem cells to try and unlock the secrets of life that only he has any right to." Her sermon was answered by numerous shouts of amen as the crowd began to rile up. Jessup pleadingly looked around himself for help, only growing more and more nervous as the shouting grew louder. "And now, his judgment has come upon us. The fiend is let loose. Star Wormwood blazes." Her finger came to point at Jessup once more. "And it is his fault." "No," Jessup cried out, his fear turning to desperate anger at last. "It is not my fault. They have spit into the eye of the Almighty." "No." Jessup jumped to his feet and tried to run, but he was forcefully grabbed by Jim and thrown forward into the crowd of Mrs. Carmody's bloodthirsty followers. The crowd began pummeling him in his attempts to escape, driving him back into the circle and bouncing him around like a trapped animal in a cage. David lunged forward again, but this time, Jim turned and drove his fist hard into David's face, staggering him and forcing him back once more. Ollie and Ambrose both supported him so that he didn't fall to the floor, but their hands now held him back as well. Angered shouts grew more vicious as the crowd continued to punish Jessup. Shoves turned into punches, and Jessup's pained shouts made David's stomach churn. He was just a kid, couldn't have been older than 19. And yet, the angry mob still tore into him as though he was nothing more than a rabid dog. How did it come to this? How had they lost their grip so much that they were now lashing out at someone who wasn't even responsible for this? David saw the knife appear moments before it struck, and even still, he almost couldn't believe it when Mr. McVeigh, the once kind man that operated the grill for the store, buried his favorite cooking utensil in Jessup's stomach. What had once been the kindly gentleman that always offered Billy a free sample of whatever he was cooking for the day had turned into nothing more than a Zelotes acolyte, and David's shouts were drowned out by the crowd as Mr. McVeigh stabbed Jessup once more. Twice more. Blood now dripped freely onto the linoleum, sprouting fat red puddles on the otherwise polished white surface. Jessup's cries ceased, for now his mouth hung agape in pain and shock, unable to comprehend what was happening to him. David watched in horror as little old ladies and mothers and fathers all closed in on the poor boy. People who Jessup had once regarded as neighbors and even friends were now all cheering as blood seeped from his stomach. Whatever humanity they'd once had now evaporated courtesy of the mist outside. And above all the chaos, despite the roar of the crowd and the frantic pleas of David and his group to stop, Mrs. Carmody's voice carried over the aisles and counters. "Feed him to the beasts. Let the abominations smell his blood. Expiation! Expiation!" Jessup's howling form was hoisted into the air, countless hands holding him aloft and starting towards the doors. His limbs, whether by intention or not, were spread in a sacrificial posture as the bellowing mob raced up the aisle and towards the outside. Groceries and items were knocked haphazardly from their shelves as the mindless crowd stampeded forward, leaving smashed jars and flattened boxes in their wake. "No," David called out. He moved to stop them, but Ollie and Ambrose still held him back. "Let me go. We have to stop them." "No, David," came Ollie's voice. It was tired and defeated, but it still carried a sense of finality. "We need you, David. Billy needs you. God admit, they'll throw you out there too if you try to stop them." David still struggled, and it was only when he saw Billy's frightened and tear-stained face that he reluctantly stopped trying to reach Jessup. Instead, David fell to his knees and pulled Billy close, wrapping him in a hug and doing everything he could to ignore Jessup's screams as they grew more distant. He looked up to see that Jessup was halfway out of the door. The wounded private had still enough fight to grab onto the doorframe before he was completely thrown out, but his struggles were in vain as multiple hands reached out and tore his fingers away from the frame. Once outside completely, the mob threw him onto the asphalt of the parking lot, and Jessup weakly cried out as he landed hard on his side, his hands clutching his stomach as blood still oozed from his wounds. The doors were closed once more, and the lock bolts were thrown before Jessup could even struggle to his feet. Shakily, Jessup rose and stumbled back to the door, taking one hand from his stomach and pounding on the glass, begging to be let in by anyone who would listen. Jim's hard glare stared back at him from the other side, and David could only watch as Jessup continued to pound against the door, his bloody hand smearing the glass. There was a noise, something akin to a dull roar, and Jessup's struggles immediately ceased as he slowly turned to gaze out into the mist. The noise had been muffled slightly from the doors, but it had still been loud enough that everyone inside the store had heard it. Whatever had made the noise, it had been large, and in that next moment, David was glad that he was holding Billy's head to his chest, for a vile shape loomed and took form outside. Hunched over and walking on four insect-like appendages, the thing looked to be a cross between a crab and a praying mantis, its nightmarish form only accentuated by its hulking size. It could smell Jessup's blood on the pavement and on his clothes, and as the creature drew closer, Jessup slowly turned and pressed a bloody palm onto the door in one last attempt to appeal to the forsaken humanity on the other side. "Please!" A claw the length of a tree reached for him, but it never landed. Instead, a burst of fire and flame erupted against the monster's bulk, the force of the sound rattling the windows and causing everyone in the store to flinch. Outside, Jessup whirled around and fell to the asphalt in shock, landing in a sitting position with his back propped up against the glass. The creature itself recovered and turned towards where the explosion had come from, and David saw a small ball of light emerge from somewhere in the mist and fly straight into the Lovecraftian terror, leaving a trail of blackened exhaust in the air as it passed through. When it landed, the ball of light gave off a second explosion, and the monster recoiled and staggered backward. The crowd screamed and yelled in confusion at what they saw, and then everyone jumped as three more balls of light appeared in rapid succession, following each other like train cars as they homed in on the monster and detonated just like the ones before. The combined power of the three rapid explosions overwhelmed the monster, and it listed to the side before tumbling down into the parking lot with a loud crash, flattening at least 5 cars with the size of its now dead body. The silhouette twitched a few times, then fell still. An odd silence fell over the store, and David heard nothing save for the ringing in his own ears. All eyes searched the mist fervently for any sign as to the source of the projectiles, and after a moment, a smaller, more humanoid shape emerged. David squinted for a few moments as the mist obscured much of the strange form. Then his eyes widened as the figure revealed itself to be a figure dressed entirely in some sort of green spacesuit. A large weapon was held easily in its hands, and though David was no expert, he deemed the weapon to be some sort of rocket launcher, as it had a large opening in the back to vent the exhaust generated by the missiles. The figure spared the now lifeless monster a look, then approached the store, the rocket launcher somehow disappearing from its grip. It stopped once it was within a few feet of the doors, its helmeted gaze looking down at Jessup's slumped form on the pavement. The soldier was barely conscious now thanks to his blood loss, and his chest rose and fell with shaky breaths as he looked back up at the armored figure with hazy eyes. The spaceman looked from Jessup to the astonished crowd watching him from the windows, and then seemed to grow incredibly angry. His tilted head and clenched fists betrayed that his anger was likely directed at the occupants in the store, and David lost sight of the figure for a second as it knelt down next to Jessup. The crowd murmured and craned their necks to see what he was doing, and David could see looks of confusion and awe on their faces. Even Mrs. Carmody looked frightened, as even she did not have an explanation for what it was they were currently seeing. The figure rose back to full height a few moments later, carrying a now unconscious Jessup underneath one of his arms. He did not seem to slump with the weight at all. In fact, it seemed that carrying the soldier was more of an annoyance than an actual physical effort. The stranger stepped forward and glared through the glass at Jim, who stood on the other side. It was obvious to everyone present that the figure wanted him to open the door, but Jim stood frozen in place. Initially, it might have been from shock and awe, but Jim then set his jaw and crossed his arms, now actively declining to comply with the stranger's silent request. This served only to anger the figure further, and before David's eyes, the spaceman grabbed the metal frame of the door with his free hand and ripped it off its hinges entirely. Glass shattered and metal screeched as the door immediately bowed to the inhuman display of strength, and much of the metal framing around the door was shorn away as well, leaving behind a warped hole of what jagged and twisted metal remained. Through his newly crafted entryway, the armored figure stepped through, grabbing Jim by the front of his shirt and quite literally throwing him out of the way as he entered the store. Heavy footfalls echoed loudly throughout the store as he marched in, and though he had not spoken, David could feel his anger at the humans inside. It was as though he could smell the rotten stench of their frenzied mob mentality, and David saw him shake his head before the helmeted gaze turned to him and his group, who were all still gathered a short distance away from the main mob. The stranger seemed to come to a decision, and as he marched toward them, a polite and robotic voice spoke out from somewhere on his armor, its cordial tone completely at odds with the enraged tone conveyed by his body language. I would ask that everyone please retreat to the rear of the building and away from the windows. Masking your scent decreases the chance of drawing more creatures to this location. The words were kind and polite, but no one moved as the figure deposited Jessup's form on the linoleum next to David and the others. Ollie immediately rushed forward to try and tend to the private's knife wounds, and David glanced over as the former clerk pulled open the blood-soaked fabric of the uniform, only to frown in confusion a moment later when he saw that all of Jessup's wounds were gone. There were no signs of a stabbing in his stomach. In fact, there didn't appear to be any sign of struggle or violence on the kid's body at all save for the stains on his uniform. David shared a bewildered glance with Ollie, then frowned up at the stranger. The armored human gave no elaboration, however, and instead turned towards the meat department at the end of the aisle. There was a loud noise as the figure wrenched the door to the freezer open, and after rummaging around for a few moments, the armored man re-emerged, and slung over his shoulder was a massive side of beef, nearly half a cow, in fact. David guessed that it was from a meat shipment that must have arrived the night before, and Mr. McVeigh had not yet been given the chance to butcher it properly. Now, the figure held it easily over his shoulder as he marched back forward to the front of the store, pausing only to snatch a 3-gallon container of lighter fluid from one of the shelves as well. As he returned to the front of the store, the polite voice spoke once again. I must insist that everyone please stand away from the windows. We cannot guarantee your safety if you do not. And just what are you supposed to be? Mrs. Carmody said, finding her voice at last. Are you the gracious hero sent by the military to save the day? Are you holding out some hope that fighting fruitlessly against the creatures of the pit will absolve you of your crimes in bringing them down upon us? The crowd stirred, finding some sense of lunatic normalcy in Mrs. Carmody's accusations. Yeah, someone jeered from the crowd. This is your fault in the first place. Meddling with God's creation, you brought down his wrath. My initial observations give no indication that the creatures and meteorological phenomena that exist in this world are the result of divine intervention. It has been our experience that dimensional anomalies, such as these, are more likely caused by rudimentary attempts at interdimensional travel. See? Do you all see? Mrs. Carmody shrieked, riling the crowd up once again. Denial. Denial of his wrath. Denial of guilt. He claims to have come to guarantee our safety, but he has already forgotten that it was he who placed us all on the path to damnation in the first place. The crowd jeered and screamed at the armored man, and David watched apprehensively. Your hubris will be the undoing of us all. To be so deluded that you think you can withstand judgment and emerge unscathed. You are nothing, nothing but a usurper, a false idol. That last statement seemed to resonate within the armored man, and before the crowd could jeer anymore, the stranger loudly dropped the meat he was carrying and reached out to the side with his gauntlet. A sudden blue light burst from the gauntlet itself with a loud crack, and David stared incredulously as the light took on a rope-like shape, arcing through the air and into the aisle adjacent to the one he and his group were occupying. The sight and sound of the light rope itself was enough to startle Mrs. Carmody and her followers into silence once more, and a few of the closer bystanders took an apprehensive step back in response. The rope of blue light suddenly went taut as it latched onto something within the aisle, and with a simple flick of his wrist, the stranger retracted the light back into the gauntlet before catching a small object that was connected to the other end. As the figure brought the object to bear, David frowned when he saw that the object appeared to be a pre-made tube of cake frosting, one that already came with its own narrow tip at the end so that the user could draw details and write words on their own prospective cakes. What the figure could want with something like that at a time like this, David could only guess. Stepping forward dangerously, the stranger closed the distance between himself and Mrs. Carmody, who still stared back at him in a stunned silence in response to the blue rope of light that had been summoned and dissipated in less than half a second. Before Mrs. Carmody could regain her wits, the stranger brought the frosting tube to her forehead and expertly spelled out 3 distinct characters on the exposed skin, dark brown frosting flowing easily from the tube and sticking to where the stranger drew the tip across her face. Once he had finished, the stranger let the tube of frosting fall to the floor, and David could have sworn that he detected the slightest twinge of humor. Maybe. As the figure hefted the side of beef once again and stepped out of the hole in the front door he had made and out into the mist, David watched him go, then turned his head back to Mrs. Carmody's group as one of the older women let out an audible gasp and stepped backward from their leader, her gaze suddenly fearful as she stared at the 3 characters on Mrs. Carmody's forehead. A frightened scream was let out as more and more survivors read the characters, and Mrs. Carmody herself looked fearfully back and forth among her once loyal followers. What? She demanded. What does it say? No one answered her, and David, despite everything, held back a small chuckle as he read the characters in their dark brown font for the first time. Oh God in heaven, save us! Jim cried out from where he had shakily risen after being tossed aside by the stranger. He fell back to his knees and clasped his hands together in fervent prayer, as if to ward off the symbols he saw on Mrs. Carmody's face. What? Tell me what it fucking says. Mrs. Carmody said, her panic giving way to anger as no one volunteered to tell her what they saw. Despite it all, none of her devout followers dared answer, as though it were a curse to speak of what they saw before them. Looking around wildly, Mrs. Carmody finally turned toward the glass windows that made up the front of the store and strode forward hastily. Moving so that her nose was mere inches from the glass, the pious woman squinted to make out the characters, and David watched with humor of his own when her eyes widened and her lips began to tremble as she read the characters out loud. S6, 6, 6. Mrs. Carmody let out a blood-curdling shriek and recoiled as though she'd been stabbed, her hands jumping up to her forehead, but halting a few inches from where the 3 6s had been drawn, as though actually touching the frosting would somehow cause her to disintegrate. He's the Antichrist, she sputtered, more or less just screaming in fear now instead of preaching. Her fanatic followers panicked even more at seeing her falter, and shouts of despair and horror filled the store as they all began to shuffle around like chickens with their heads cut off. In the back of his mind, David felt like the stranger had known that something like this would have happened when he'd drawn the numbers on her forehead in the first place. And David also felt the sneaking suspicion that he'd done it for the sole purpose of causing Mrs. Carmody and her followers to chaotically lose their minds even more so than they'd already had. He'd likely known that attempting to convince the old bat that he was there to help them would undoubtedly fail, so he had decided to at least get a laugh out of her zealotry by doubling down on her accusations. Needless to say, it worked. The results were speaking, or in this case screaming, for themselves. One man screamed and pointed to where the armored man had dropped the tube of cake frosting he'd used to draw on Mrs. Carmody's face, and terrified shouting started anew as he read the words, "Devil's chocolate icing," on the side. Mrs. Carmody then fainted, as did a few other of her followers. Then the rest fell silent, as well as another loud bang was heard from the mist outside. Utilizing the sensors within the Preter's suit, Vega continued his examination of the strange fog to the best of his ability. While the range of data he could compile from the relatively rudimentary sensors was not by any means ideal, Vega was still able to draw a few distinct general conclusions about the mist itself. Firstly, sound seemed to be remarkably dampened by the fog, which in turn led Vega to understand that the mist was constituted of more than just suspended water particles in the air, and that some other compound, one that was not an ideal medium for sound waves, was also present. This observation was further validated by the acknowledgement that fumes and scents propagated at a far greater rate within the fog, meaning that one's sense of smell was drastically heightened when enshrouded within the mist. Examination of a few of the creatures the Slayer had terminated showed that their olfactory organs were also highly developed, allowing them to detect the scent of even the smallest of prey from miles away. Whether the properties that dampened sound and the properties that increased scent were one and the same remained yet to be seen, and had Vega more time and a greater array of data at his disposal, he undoubtedly would have discovered the truth within a few hours, but he unfortunately had neither of those, so he would have to make do with what information he had. Unlike him, however, the Doomslayer seemed more than satisfied with what little they had discovered about the nature of the mist, as he had already put the information to more practical use by way of the half-cow carcass that he had carried out into the middle of the street. One final property that Vega had discerned about the mist was that it was rapidly expanding, and that a single point of origin existed within the mountains beyond. The AI had effortlessly pinpointed the location within a meter or so of tolerance. But before he and the Slayer could endeavor to investigate, they would need to ensure the survival of the humans sheltered inside the supermarket. To do so meant that all life forms originating from a mist in the immediate area would need to be terminated, and thanks to the data Vega had already collected, the Slayer had developed an efficient method of luring them in. Depositing the half-frozen cow carcass in the middle of the intersection that the supermarket was around, the Slayer wasted no time ripping the top off the large bottle of lighter fluid and dousing the meat with its contents. Once it was empty, the Slayer discarded the metal container and ignited the mixture with a single round from his plasma rifle, the fuel-soaked meat immediately thawing and charring with the heat from the resulting blaze. As the Slayer had planned, the strong smell of burning meat immediately bloomed from the center of the road, and the mist rapidly propagated the smell outward in every direction, covering an exceptionally large cloud throughout the town that smelled like cooking beef. The response was almost immediate, and the Predator suit systems detected movement and heat signatures all around them as predators from another world gathered for what they thought would be a feast, though what followed was certain to be nothing other than a slaughter. The hound snarled as it ripped a large chunk of scaly skin from the monster's body, eliciting a pained and indignant hiss from the reptilian creature as it recoiled and attempted to retaliate with a bite of its own. Its large jaw clamped shut on nothing but air, however, as the hound had seen the move coming and sprang away to separate itself. It landed a few feet away and squared itself off against the creature once more, and for a moment neither of them moved, a brief pause falling over their battle as they growled and hissed at each other with animosity. The reptile was still fighting strong, though the hound could tell that its stamina had been drained by a considerable amount. Several glancing blows showed on the creature's form, but only a few of its wounds could be considered serious. The monster's speed had been impressive despite the hound's preparedness for it, and despite the fact that the alpha was definitely winning the battle, it was not without considerable effort. The hound itself had only sustained a few minor cuts on its hide from the creature's claws, and though it had refused to utilize teleportation during the battle in order to heighten the challenge, it had needed to resort to it once in order to dodge what could have been a distinct blow from the reptile's razor-sharp bite. As it turned out, the creature itself had been smarter than the hound had given it credit for, and it had waited until a few minutes into the battle that it had spewed a highly corrosive acid from its mouth in an attempt to melt the hellhound into a puddle. Thankfully, the alpha had seen the move coming, as the creature's already bulbous lower jaw had bulged considerably more right before spewing the acid, which had given the alpha the heads up it needed to avoid the spray. Seeing the hound completely avoid one of the tricks it had saved up had caused the creature to pause in shock, which had given the hound all the time it had needed to headbutt the creature's jaw closed upon its own tongue, which had been protruding from its mouth in order to effectively spew the acid. The tongue had been sliced completely off by its owner's own razor-sharp teeth, and as the reptile bellowed and coughed on the blood that immediately flooded its mouth, the hound devoured the tongue easily, the small amounts of residual acid only slightly burning its mouth for a few moments before being evaporated by the hound's internal hellfire. Seeing its tongue being eaten by its opponent had served only to infuriate the monster further, as the hound had intended, and now a dirty red mixture of blood and acid dripped from its mouth and onto the forest floor, dissolving any leaves and twigs that happened to be underneath. The hound's attention was momentarily diverted as it caught the faint whiff of meat burning in the air. The scent was strong, but it was still remarkably minuscule among the other smells that filled the hound's nostrils at the moment, meaning that it was quite a distance away, but the hound surmised the slayer to be the likely culprit behind the sound. The hound acknowledged the scent, then returned its full attention back to its foe, who did not seem to notice the scent at all. Determined not to give the creature any further respite, the hound lunged once again, this time searching for an opening that it could take to strike the killing blow. Darkened blood sprayed onto the street as dual chainsaw blades severed a large tentacle from its main body. The pack-a-punched lancer's mechanical roar drowned out the squealing from the creature at the other end, as the slayer immediately turned and fired upon the horde of spiders that had been drawn from the pharmacy adjacent to the store. The arachnids exploded into fragments and red clouds of blood as a hail of high-pitched gunfire tore through them, their large constitutions still less than a match for the enhanced rounds. The spiders had been dead for less than a few seconds before the slayer drew his combat shotgun and opened fire into the air above, the widespread of buckshot proving to be an efficient choice against the swarm of pterodactyl-like monstrosities that circled above. By twos and threes they began to drop, the air so thick with them that each blast from the shotgun struck multiple at once. A few fell directly onto the now blazing pile of meat that burned in the middle of the street, their lithe forms immediately charring and only adding to the increasingly intense scent that permeated from the flames. The Slayer's plan had worked perfectly, and now creatures from the mist were appearing in droves to get at the de facto barbecue that the Doom Slayer had started. None had a chance to feast, however, as they began to foolishly target the Slayer as soon as they saw him, thinking that his fresh meat would be far more preferable to the dead-cooked meat on the pile. They would never get the chance to find out. As the severed nub of the tentacle the Slayer had cut retreated, another tentacle of equal size emerged from the mist and started toward him. The Slayer, growing increasingly agitated that the creature had yet to emerge completely, activated his instinct leash and latched onto the tentacle as close to the base of it as he could reach. The Slayer heaved as the leash connected, but in a rare event of miscalculation, the fortitude of the tentacle failed to withstand the combined force of the Slayer's pull and the creature's apparently monumental inertia, and with a wet-ripping noise, the tentacle tore in two where the leash had latched on, pulling nearly 6 meters worth of the appendage free of its base and towards the Slayer while the other half snapped back into the shadows. Furious, the Slayer made use of the still flopping appendage by altering its trajectory as it flew towards him. Raising it up by a few meters, the tentacle sailed over his head by less than a foot and through the middle of the blazing pile of carrion in the middle of the street. The thick slime coating the tentacle was apparently flammable, and it ignited almost immediately as its form passed through the center of the inferno. With the mass and size of a large tree, the flaming tentacle emerged from the other side of the conflagration at high speed, crashing into an oncoming swarm of carnivorous, flying insects on the other side. The momentum of the large appendage knocked the swarm in disarray, while outright crushing those unfortunate enough to be in its path. And the doomed slayer capitalized on their momentary discombobulation by lobbing a grenade into the air and into the center of their broken formation. The well-timed detonation sent insect innards flying in every direction, splattering the pavement further with more evidence of the Slayer's massacre. The dull yellow pus that erupted from the insect stood out in contrast to the darkened blood that coated the concrete in a thick base, creating a mosaic of slaughter that an artist with a twisted sense of humor might have found beautiful. The Slayer paid no attention to the imagery he was leaving behind on the canvas that was the street. However, as the previously distant owner of the tentacles he had severed so far chose that moment to confront him fully. Shuffling from the shadows in an ever-writhing mass of slithering appendages, the Slayer noted that its main body lacked much in the way of a rigid form, instead consisting of a large amorphous pile of flesh that served as an origin for its nearly countless limbs. The mountain of flesh had emerged from behind the supermarket itself, and cars were easily pushed and scraped aside as the gargantuan form shuffled closer to the doomed Slayer. A pair of eyes the size of manhole covers stared unblinkingly at the Slayer as it drew even closer, and he could see his own form reflected in the inky pupils, the light of the blaze behind him casting him as a dark shadow that stood prominently against the mist. Eyes of that size would have stricken any of the humans inside the store with unequivocal terror, but to the Slayer, they were nothing more than weak points, and their size only meant they were easier to target. In a flash, the Slayer activated the leash again and thrust his arm towards the tentacled monster, his aim locked dead center into the creature's left eye, instead of arcing through the air and latching onto the sensitive organ. However, the instinct leash weakly flashed for a few moments before sputtering out, hardly making it a quarter of the distance to its intended target before it died completely. It would seem that the instinct leash is ill-equipped to interface with increased mental facilities such as yours, Vegas said, immediately running diagnostics on the device as it flickered and sparked on the Slayer's wrist. It is my recommendation that you limit its use until we are able to reinforce its internal components, as continued undue strain has the potential to cause irreparable damage to the device. The Slayer's tactical mind immediately shifted to accommodate this new information, albeit annoyedly, as he had been warming up to the leash and its ability to amplify his capacity to rip and tear through his enemies. But it was of little consequence in the end, as all it truly meant was that he would have to utilize his more tried and true methods of achieving his goals. The Gauss cannon appeared in his hands in the next moment, and before the tentacled monster could grab for him with one of its countless limbs, a super-accelerated flechette of reinforced steel pierced its left eye and into its center mass. The lack of a more rigid body resulted in very little resistance to the projectile as it carved through its body, and with plenty of momentum to spare, the rod of metal emerged from the other side of the monster's body and continued on, burying itself 100 meters away in the chest of a large beetle-like creature that had also been advancing towards the Slayer. The decay imparted from the rod turned the enormous insect's heart to ash in the span of a few seconds, and the creature seized wildly as its body underwent extreme cardiac arrest. Its rapidly flailing limbs slowed and then eventually went limp after a few seconds, however, and the insect died without ever even laying eyes on its killer. Back at the blazing intersection, the tentacled monster screeched loudly and recoiled, dozens of tentacles retracting towards the rapidly expanding hole that was its left eye. Its soft and squishy flesh that had done little against the Gauss cannon's ammunition was now doing even less against the decay that followed, and the Slayer could easily see daylight poking through the other side of its body as the decay continued to spread. The monster, however, was hardly finished yet, as its lack of a centralized nervous system meant that despite the massive hole in its main mass, it was still very much alive, and it was now seethingly angry. Roughly a dozen tentacles lashed out in a rapid blur to impart its pain back onto the Slayer, who reacted equally as fast with another well-placed shot from the Gauss cannon. This time, the shot pierced through 3 of the tentacles at once, severing them from the creature and imparting further decay onto it. The remaining tentacles continued their advance, and the Slayer drew his lancer once more as they closed in. David had stared with his mouth agape when the large tentacled mass had shuffled past the window of the store. Even from the back of the building, he had still caught a glimpse of the Goliath as it had gone by, moving towards the faint glow of a fire that they could just barely make out through the thick fog. Many others had seen it as well, and even those who hadn't seen it had heard at least, as the sound was like that of skin being dragged across the asphalt. only many times magnified, as though whatever was moving outside had enough skin to cover an elephant, or maybe three. Everyone had heeded the armored man's advice and had taken shelter away from the windows, and even Mrs. Carmody's group had eventually yielded once they began to hear shooting and the sounds of carnage just outside their vision. Mrs. Carmody herself had taken to mumbling continuous and repeated prayers from where she knelt next to some of her most devout followers, Jim being one of them. "It will not come unless the apostasy comes first," she recited, "and the man of lawlessness is revealed." The last of her sanity had all but abandoned her, and though she was far more gone than she had been, David noticed with a bittersweet feeling that she was not as aggressive and vocal as she had been before. Her subdued nature had spread also to her followers, and despite the screams and roars of the creatures just outside those doors, David felt incrementally more safe than he had been before. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. "Oh, get a rest already," Irene said at last, the older woman's patience with Mrs. Carmody finally reaching its limit. "As if what's going on outside isn't enough to scare the children half to death, your incessant rambling is certainly not helping." "They should be scared," Mrs. Carmody deadpanned, her voice devoid of any emotion at all, as though she'd lost all of the piousness she'd previously held. "The Unmaker has already come upon us, and there is nothing that can stop what happens next." "You honestly believe that man is some sort of antichrist just because he put frosting on your forehead?" Irene scolded. "He did that just to shut you up. Hell, if I'd known that would work, I'd have painted your forehead myself almost 2 days ago when you started spouting all this nonsense. He's just a soldier from a base, dressed in one of those combat suits that you see on TV all the time." Mrs. Carmody scoffed. "You think I'm being delusional, you old bitch? No mere soldier possesses the strength that he does. He has pulled the wool over all of your eyes with his promises and pride." A bit of bite had found its way back into Mrs. Carmody's voice, but this did not deter Irene at all. "So what exactly was your plan then, oh divine preacher? Were you just going to denounce anyone that comes to our rescue as some kind of deceiver? Were you hoping we wouldn't get rescued at all so that you can keep spouting your crap to these people?" And the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast. They worshipped the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who is able to wage war with him?" Irene looked as though she was about to retort to Mrs. Carmody's recitation, but David cleared his throat to stop her. It was obvious that Mrs. Carmody was past reasoning at this point, and all Irene was going to do by arguing with her was make things worse. With any luck, the armored man outside held their best interests at heart, which certainly seemed to be the case if the dying cries of the monstrosities outside were any indication of his motives. David just hoped that he could find a way home soon to Stephanie, and that maybe the armored stranger, or at least someone like him, was helping her as well. The reptilian creature had stopped moving a few seconds ago, but the hound watched it even still, watching for the subtle rise and fall that would tell if it was still breathing. When a monster still failed to move, only then did the hound look away, inhaling deep the now very strong scent of burning flesh. It had grown steadily more apparent as the brawl had drawn to a close, but by that time, the victor was all but decided. In the end, the stamina of the reptile had run out, and its speed had dropped drastically enough for the alpha to dig its claws and fangs deep under its skin. It had died via blood loss from its more serious wounds, and the hound celebrated its victory with a deep howl as it considered its next move. The burning scent was now undoubtedly the work of the slayer, and the hound, despite its orders, felt an overwhelming desire to join him in his bountiful hunt. It toyed with the decision for a few moments more, then made up its mind. With a flash of lightning, the hound warped back down into the basement of the house once more, startling the human female once again and causing her to unconsciously jump away from where it had appeared. When she recognized the hound, she slowly relaxed once more, though the alpha was indifferent to her body language at the moment, and it squinted as it inspected her for any sign of wounds or sickness. Finding none, the hound then trotted up the stairs to the door leading out of the basement, ensuring that it was locked by pressing the button firmly into the handle with its snout before returning to the bottom of the steps. It examined the human one last time to make absolutely sure that she was fine, and she frowned in confusion at its sudden interest in her before self-consciously looking down at herself to see if she could see anything wrong. Once it was assured that she was okay, the hound gave the human a small grunt of finality, and before she had the chance to decipher its meaning, the canine warped out of the basement and towards the scent of the Slayer's wrath. The distance was great enough that it took 2 jumps through subspace to reach him, and the hound emerged at his location slightly winded with the effort of warping such a distance in such a short amount of time. The sight that greeted it was typical of the Doomslayer, as he was currently embattled with some sort of gigantic tentacle monster while simultaneously picking off a rapidly growing horde of lesser creatures of the mist. As usual, he was in control of the situation, but the hound could see that the large tentacled monster was drawing a large amount of his attention, as despite the numerous wounds he had inflicted upon it, it was still alive and actively attacking him. Despite that, the hound knew that the battle between them could not have been going on for very long, as the Slayer had not yet utilized some of his arsenal that would be far more effective against the monstrosity. The only reason for that being that he simply hadn't switched to them yet, deciding to prove that it was far more useful here than guarding a single human that was under no threat at the moment. The hound took notice of one of the creature's severed tentacles that had fallen into the blaze that now dominated the street. The slimy substance that coated the appendage appeared to burn easily, and after taking note that the creature had a considerably sized hole in its body where its left eye should have been, the hound wasted no time springing into action. Foregoing teleportation in favor of showmanship, the Alpha sprinted forward, ignoring the look the Slayer gave it as it ran directly between him and the monster, blocking his firing line just as he was drawing another weapon. The tentacled creature itself just barely tracked the hound with its good eye as it blurred closer, but its reaction time was not nearly sufficient enough as the hound wove through its mass of tentacles and dove forward directly into the hole that was once its left eye socket. There was just barely enough room for the hound to fit, but that suited the Alpha well for what came next. As soon as it had fully entered the eye hole, the hound gave a great roar of effort and willed its hell hide to alight to its maximum. Flames immediately filled the limited space around it that constituted the creature's central body, then jetted outward from both openings, engulfing the monster's entire body in hellfire in a matter of seconds, as hellfire burned far more strongly and at much greater temperatures than any standard blaze of the mortal plane. The creature let out a blood-curdling screech and writhed around madly as it tried to reach for the hound with its burning tentacles. But the hound refused to warp away and willed its hide to burn brighter, searing away the meat closest to it completely. The creature's remaining eye glowed brightly for the briefest of moments before burning away as well, and the supernatural inferno sprouted from the empty socket and jetted into the sky. David and everyone else stared as the faint glow they had been seeing since the armored man had left suddenly grew exponentially. Even from the back of the store did the light shine brightly, burning away the mist completely and revealing a horrible nightmare of a beast. The clear sight of tentacled monster may have once struck David cold with fear, but seeing it wreathed in a nearly white-hot conflagration left him only struck with awe. He turned his head away as it began to glow too brightly to stare at, but he could still feel the slight heat coming through the glass and the open entryway the armored man had created earlier. A high-pitched hum obstructed all other sound, and David pulled Billy close and held him tight despite his lack of fear. Nothing about that fire was normal, but somehow, David knew that it was not meant for him. The hound gave one final push, then finally unclenched, letting its flames die back down to their normal intensity before tiredly warping out of the monster's now barely twitching form and in front of the Doomslayer. To teleport even a few feet was difficult now, and the Alpha growled with the strain as it looked up to meet the Slayer's gaze, its sides heaving with the effort of what it had just done. It had never strained itself like that before, but it had not done so without reason. Though it knew that the Slayer did not regard it as weak by any means, it had still felt insulted by his order to remain behind to guard the human female. Such tasking was not why the Alpha had chosen to remain with him. And though it knew that the Doomslayer had not commanded the hound for no reason at all, the hound needed him to know that it would not take such orders, and that if it was to stay, then it would not be used as some guard dog that looked after lost humans while the Slayer participated in the hunt alone. The promise of challenging prey was the sole reason it had decided to join him at all, and though it would always respect and revere the Doomslayer for sparing its life, its gratitude had its limits. It would certainly go out of its way to save those in need, but its true purpose did not lie in the rescue of others. If it could not hunt, then it would have been better for the Slayer to kill it in those woods when he'd freed it from the control of the dark ether. It met his hard gaze with resolution, and it growled once more and planted its feet firmly despite its exhaustion. It had made its point of that, there was no doubt. Now, it was up to the Doomslayer to decide how to respond. For a long moment, the two of them stared at each other, the moment tense despite the cries of dying prey all around them. Then the Slayer relaxed his posture, his body language showing that he accepted the terms that the hound had wordlessly laid out. Only then did the Alpha relax its shoulders as well and show how tired it was, though the Slayer had likely already known how hard it had just pushed itself. Looking around and giving the air an experimental sniff told the hound that while it had been making its argument via frying the tentacled monstrosity from the inside, the Doomslayer had taken the opportunity to kill any remaining creatures of the mist. There was now no scent of a living being for miles around save for the frightened humans inside the glass-fronted building just a few meters away, and the hound approached the still burning pile of corpses that littered the street, taking the opportunity to replenish its depleted energy by feasting on some of the more well-done pieces of meat. The Doomslayer took his time to examine the corpses as well, likely both for his own benefit and for the benefit of the voice in his armor, then turned toward the hound once more after some time had passed. The hound had expected this request to come, but the Slayer had waited until it had regained some of its strength. He wanted the hound to retrieve the human female and bring her to the others, and though the hound understood the nature of the request, it still tilted its head in a questioning manner, wanting assurance that if it fulfilled the request, the Slayer would not depart on another hunt until it returned. It was reassured with a nod, and after taking another minute to stretch its aching form, the hound warped back to where it had left the human female, this time warping outside the door to the basement and giving a few taps with its paw so as not to startle her as much. When it did not hear any movement for a few moments, the hound gave a non-threatening bark to confirm its identity, and only then did the female tentatively climb the stairs and open the door. At first, she'd only opened the door just wide enough to confirm that it was the hound on the other side, then she'd slowly opened it all the way before looking down at the awaiting canine. With a brief shake of its fur, the hound diminished its flames and stretched its neck out expectantly, gesturing to the human that it wanted her to grab hold. She frowned her eyes in confusion, and after a few moments, the hound impatiently nudged its head under her hand to clarify what it wanted her to do. The human seemed to finally understand, and she cautiously but firmly placed her hand on top of the hound's head, and after making sure she had a firm grasp, the hound summoned the teleportational lightning and warped back towards the Slayer's location. Like before, the distance required 2 separate jumps, and when they'd emerged in front of the building, the female doubled over and retched onto the asphalt of the parking lot, her body used to making not just 1 but 2 jumps in rapid succession. The voice inside the Slayer's suit addressed her once she recovered, seemingly directing her inside the store and towards the others of her kind. The woman gave an apprehensive look towards the store, then nodded and gave what the hound guessed to be an awkward verbal thanks to the Slayer, and it before hastening towards the broken doors and out of the mist. Once she disappeared safely inside, the Slayer turned towards the hound again, though this time, it was to gauge its readiness rather than request that it stay behind. The hound's fur eagerly alighted despite its remaining weariness, and it gave an affirmative bark to signal that it was prepared to hunt once again. With that, the Slayer turned and started toward the mountains in the distance, likely towards a destination that perhaps led to the source of the creatures of the mist, the alpha hellhound immediately warping ahead and sniffing for any prey that yet lurked along their path. Despite everything David had seen over the last 3 days, somehow it was this moment that seemed the least believable of it all. Yesterday, the gunfire and inferno that had gone on just outside the store had eventually died down, and shortly afterward, the armored man disappeared without a trace. But he had not left without leaving one thing behind. However, and that came in the form of a single human that had apprehensively walked through the broken entryway to the store that the armored man had made. Stephanie. When David had first seen her, he had been so certain that he had died, that the massive inferno that had been so bright and hot only 15 minutes before had killed him, and he was now seeing her visage before he passed on. But when she had burst into tears and choked out his name upon seeing him too, he decided that he didn't care if he was dead, and he'd scooped Billy up in his arms and carried him all the way to her, wrapping his arms around them both as tightly as he could and refusing to let go. They were together again, and all David cared about was that. The mist didn't matter anymore. For how long the 3 of them held each other, David did not know, and the only reason that they had eventually separated was to investigate the sudden changes they had seen outside. Everyone in the store tentatively moved forward to investigate the first disturbance they'd seen since the armored man disappeared into the mist, and to their disbelief, the veil seemed to be lifting. It had been slow at first, but eventually there was no denying it. The sky was getting brighter, visibility was getting further, and the fog was getting thinner. And then, all at once, it had broken completely, and everyone within the store had squinted and shielded their eyes as the brilliance of the sun shined once more through the windows. Not a cloud could be seen in the strikingly blue sky, and for a moment, the world held the illusion that the mist had never fallen upon it. But with their newfound sight, all eyes then turned to the parking lot and the street, and that illusion was distinctly shattered. The most prominent thing above all else was the corpses, both in appearance and in number. Despite some of the bodies being easily distinguishable as hellacious creatures birthed from the unnatural fog, most were nigh unrecognizable, their carrion being desecrated to a degree that it was difficult to tell what kind of monster it had been before. Bones had been snapped or ground into the pavement, muscles had been crudely severed and mashed into paste, but most of all, entire scores of the creatures had been burned entirely to a crisp. A severely scorched mound of carrion was visible in the middle of the intersection, and it was that which eventually drew everyone's gaze to it, as the first of them cautiously exited the store and stepped out into the parking lot. The size, the smell, everything about the mound of fried corpses screamed of spite, and the once blood and innard-soaked asphalt around it now sported a stark black layer of soot and ash. It was as though the flames of hell itself had congregated upon the pile, delivering a blaze of hatred and passionate deliverance that ensured that none that encountered it could even remotely be considered once alive. A few meters away from the mound, David saw what he guessed to be the remnants of the large tentacled creature that had slithered past the store what now seemed a lifetime ago. What little structure remained of the body and limbs were coated in a dark gray skin of ash, and as they all walked among the scene, one of the more curious survivors reached out to touch one of the shriveled and ash-borne tentacles. As soon as their fingers brushed against the sooty surface, however, the entire tentacle crumbled, revealing that the entirety of the creature was now composed of only cold cinders. Its entire body had burned so quickly and so intensely that the remains did not have time to be carried away by the smoke. And so here it was, the only sign that such a creature had ever existed. Before long, the once familiar but now alien sound of approaching vehicles reached their ears, and looking down the street showed armored military vehicles approaching, vehicles that they would soon find to contain supplies and soldiers and medicines and help. It was like the army had finally been able to mobilize and react against the mist, though albeit long after the fog and its denizens were gone. In the back of his mind, David somehow knew, despite the soldiers not telling him anything about what had happened or what had driven the mist away, that the armored man had been behind this. That he, whatever he was, whether the coming of the Antichrist or some lone hero playing dress-up, had done something that had led to the return of the sun and the sky. And now, sitting here in a high school gym that had been turned into a shelter for those that had survived and been displaced by the mist, David pensively considered what the armored stranger had done to bring back the world he once knew. No, that was wrong. The world he once knew was gone. It was gone, and there was no way to bring it back. The damage had already been done. No matter how much people would try to forget and try to explain away and cover up what had happened, the fact would always remain that something else was out there. More than what they just see with their own eyes, and certainly more than what they could see with their telescopes and other instruments of science. That something, that mere confirmation of the fact that there was more, changed the very definition of reality. And it was driven home by the fact that what was out there had the capacity to wipe out humanity as they knew it. The mist had done nearly that, as David later learned that the ever-present fog had still been expanding across the country and the ocean before it had dissipated, meaning that for all anyone knew, it would have continued until the entire planet was consumed. And yet, despite the horrific reality that the end of the world had been almost upon them, the fact still remained that it had been averted. Something had put a stop to it, and the stranger that they had encountered had played a part in it. To what extent, or even how, David had no idea, but he knew for sure that he had. Whether he was some kind of false idol like Mrs. Carmody had predicted, or if he was some other kind of visitor from beyond, like the monsters of the mist had been, remained shrouded in mystery. Mrs. Carmody and a few of her more devout followers still insisted that they knew his true nature, and that the mist had been only the beginning of what would be the end times, but they had been placed into custody by the army after physically assaulting some of the soldiers that attempted to rescue them. So at the very least, David did not have to endure her fervent sermons anymore. Looking down at Stephanie and Billy, who were both fast asleep on the cot next to him, David decided for now that it didn't matter what the true nature of the stranger had been. Perhaps he was some sort of force for evil that had yet to reveal his actual plans. But for now, David regarded him only as the one who had made his family whole again. And no matter what came next, David, as well as countless others, owed him a debt far greater than all the money in the world could pay. Thank you. David was unsure if his silent words were heard or not, but he said it again anyway, and with a slight smile on his face, he laid down next to his wife and child and took them into his arms, falling into a restful sleep like he had never felt before. Author note: looking back at how many chapters I've written so far, I gotta say I'm a bit surprised that I didn't drop our protagonist into a Stephen King novel sooner. Oh well, better late than never, right? Writing this chapter actually was a bit tricky in my opinion, as I wasn't sure whether I should stick more to the book or movie version of what happened. In the end, I decided to take elements of both, withdrawing more heavily from the movie about the stuff with the soldiers and origins of the mist, and the book for characterization purposes. Not so much for David, though, as I prefer the movie version of him where he doesn't have extramarital relations. Also, Movie Ollie is a certified badass, so I lean more towards that version of him too. Also, I'm not sure why, but I particularly enjoyed writing the fight scenes in this one. Maybe it was partly because I got to mix in a bit of conflict between the Slayer and the Hellhound, but I think it was more because of the fact that the monsters of the mist offered me the opportunity to have the Slayer fight against a variety of creatures rather than just one type, which is more similar to the game. It really lets me stretch my legs and even grants me the rare opportunity to create my own monsters, as well as fun new ways for the Slayer to kill them. That being said, originality isn't really my thing, which is already evident by the fact that I write crossover fics, so the unique reptile monster that the Hound fights is probably a near carbon copy of some other creature somebody else already invented, but oh well, I still had a lot of fun writing that part. Lastly, it has come to my attention that there exist not just one, but two other works of fanfic that attribute themselves to Universal Doom for inspiration. I have read both of them in their entirety, and I must say that my feelings are conflicted. On one hand, the fact that MY work has had enough of an impact on someone that they created something of their own with it as an inspiration fills me with an indescribable joy that I almost made a scene in public when I first discovered them. Not to be dramatic or anything. On the other hand, I can't help but feel a bit sheepish as well. As much as I love that my FIC inspired them, I can't help but feel like I'm getting credit for something I really didn't do. Crossovers and universe hopping have been a thing forever, and while I love what my FIC has inspired in others, I am definitely not the first person to write a FIC where a protagonist visits multiple other universes. Maybe I'm just overthinking things. That being said, I implore anyone that likes Universal Doom to go read these fics as well. The first is titled Against All Evil by Firestorm 808, and it is also a growing anthology of the Doom Slayer battling against the baddies of the multiverse. At this point in time, there are already 5 chapters, so please go check it out. The second, titled Ben 10 Saves the Universes by Time Lord 2000, follows a different, but equally badass hero as he travels the multiverse and lends his powers to those in need. I'm sure the title gives away the protagonist in question. Please go show these fics and their authors some serious love if you like Universal Doom, and don't forget to drop a review detailing how good/bad my writing is in this chapter. With that being said, this author's note has gone way longer than it should, so I will see you all next time. Bye. ImpulsiveWeaver. Universal Doom. Chapter 37. Krampus. Part 1. Author note. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pride and boundless pleasure that I introduce you to Universal Doom's very own holiday special. Taking place in the comedy/horror movie of Krampus, the Doomslayer and company have arrived to spread a little Christmas cheer of their own. Enjoy, and always remember, I own nothing. Nicholas stood stoically on a hill, his eyes scanning over the town below with a solemn weariness that only seemed to deepen as he took in the sight. A winter storm of supernatural proportions swirled above the ice-covered houses, its source no doubt stemming from the evil that surged below. He knew the names of each and every one of the residents of this small suburban community, and it pained him so to see what had become of the once joyful populace that had kept the spirit of Christmas alive for so many years. Tonight was Christmas Eve, the night of which Nicholas was supposed to be at his strongest, and yet he had never felt so weakened and vulnerable before. This town, as well as so many others, had lost sight of the true meaning behind this time of year. And despite his efforts, Nicholas had been unable to lift their spirits with his magic. For even when he was at the pinnacle of his power, not even the great Kris Kringle could force holiday cheer into the hearts of humans. No, that was something they could only do on their own. He could only assist in what ways he knew how. It had not been enough. Slowly, throughout many years and Christmases come and gone, a dark and sinister weight had been planted within the hearts of humans across the planet, targeting those who celebrated Christmas and partook in the merry traditions of goodwill and brotherhood that Nicholas himself had created many centuries ago. Its architect? Why, none other than the sworn enemy of Christmas itself, of course. A being much older than Nicholas and far more twisted and sinister. An old titan of this planet that, like Nicholas himself, had been born of the traditions and emotions of humanity, and was now just as powerful as he was in times long past, if not even more so. Krampus. Nicholas briefly closed his eyes, as even to spawn the demon's name in his mind was enough to make him shiver despite the warmth of his weathered cloak. When Nicholas had still existed as a mere human, Krampus was a name synonymous with the final months of the year. He was a being that slumbered during the time of spring and summer, but stirred during the autumn and fully awoke in the winter. And when awake, the monster terrorized the then few and ancient humans whose very psyche had birthed him, whisking away men, women, and children alike in the dead of night to its lair. The dark and malicious emotions that were too easily associated with the coldness of winter and the worries of scarce food were akin to a feast in the eyes of the monster. And though early humanity knew of how he drew his power, they could not bring themselves to drive him away, as the magnitude of their grief and sorrow was too great to overcome on their own. It had been Nicholas himself who had first begun to push back against Krampus's wrath. At the time, he had been but a simple carpenter, but the loss of his mother and father at the odious claws of Krampus had stirred his heart to action. If Krampus fed on the darkness and ill will that resided within the hearts of humans, then the way to rid themselves of him would be to deny him his food. Though Nicholas had been a young man of very few possessions to speak of in those days, he had taken what little he had and had gifted it to the people of his village, taking even the food from his table and wrapping the rations into parcels to be opened by his neighbors. He would craft utensils and tools made of fine wood and disperse them to the community free of charge, devoting extra time and care to ensure his gifts were meaningful and would warm the cold hearts of the village folk. Unfortunately for Nicholas, Krampus's ill image still clouded the compassionate side of all when he began to dispense his gifts, and many would not open their doors to receive him when he knocked, thinking him to be a beggar or a starving neighbor asking to spare a loaf of bread. And so, it was then that Nicholas had first begun depositing his gifts down the chimneys of his neighbors and friends, smiling heartily and imagining their wary yet curious faces break into smiles of wonder and happiness upon receiving a new set of chairs for their table or an extra sack of grain to fill their hungry bellies. Of course, Nicholas never forgot to provide for the children of his village as well, as it was truly the fear and sorrow of the children that fed the nightmare of Krampus. Adults were older and more set in their ways, but the active mind of a child did far more to provide Krampus sustenance than any adult ever could. And so, Nicholas would include small wooden dolls or figurines in the parcels he deposited down the chimneys, going so far as to even learn to sew so that he could craft blankets and warm hats for the little ones. Nicholas worked tirelessly to provide something for everyone in the village, steeling himself through the initial distrust of his fellow man during the first few seasons, as Krampus's darkness made them hesitant to accept his gifts. At first, they discarded or tried to return what he would give them, thinking it to be a ploy or a way of earning future favors. But after they began to truly realize that Nicholas's actions were selfless, then their spirits slowly began to lift. The winter months, while still synonymous with Krampus's wrath, began to become associated with Nicholas and his generosity, his thankless gift giving a bright spot of warmth among the heavy chill that was Krampus. Children would begin to visit him year-round in his shop as he worked to craft his gifts, hoping to catch a glimpse of what wonderful surprises he would bestow upon them that winter. Nicholas would always kindly but firmly shoo them away each time he caught them peeking through the window, always reminding them that they would have to wait until the winter months before they could see what grand favors lie in store for them. A few seasons more, and Nicholas's spirit of giving began to spread to the other inhabitants of the village as well. Bakers would craft delicious treats to give to families. Farmers began to gift extra chickens or eggs to their patrons at little to no cost. Woodsmen would chop extra stacks of firewood to help heat the hearts of their neighbors during the cold months. Soon enough, nearly everyone in the village began to find their own ways of giving back to each other. The spirit of giving began to flourish throughout the people, simultaneously driving back Krampus's might by their spirit of joy and togetherness. Disappearances began to dwindle in number as Krampus lost his strength, and eventually, his plight stopped entirely as gift-giving on Christmas became an official tradition to the people of the village. As neighboring villages and towns began to partake in the holiday, Krampus quickly came to be forgotten by all but the older members of the community, the name becoming an afterthought as Nicholas became the new symbol of the winter months. As his name and reputation grew, so too did his workshop, as he soon began to provide gifts and toys to folks in more than just his own village. It was under this new strain of providing for so many that Nicholas began to allow children to work with him in his shop, taking 3 or 4 children under his apprenticeship to help craft his gifts. That number grew to 9 or 10 within a few seasons, and further still after that, Nicholas's workshop growing into a full-blown operation in just a few short years. It was during those years that Nicholas first felt the magic flow through him. It was magic born from the joy of so many that believed in him and what he could do. It was magic that had been stripped from Krampus when Christmas became tradition, and it was magic that grew each time another child placed their faith in the Father of Christmas. Through this magic, the common tale of Nicholas's deeds was spread far and wide. Humans everywhere began to believe in the man who selflessly gave to others during the winter months and made gifts and toys in a large workshop. Saint Nicholas, they began to call him, though Nicholas himself had felt such a title was unnecessary. Harnessing the power granted by the magic of belief, Nicholas relocated his workshop to the Arctic, a place where he would never be too far from anyone who believed in him. His most devout apprentices chose to follow him and continue spreading the cheer of Christmas. Though nearly all were still children or perhaps young teenagers, Nicholas had been moved by their passion, and at their request, he had used his magic to increase their lifespans, allowing them to retain their youth for centuries and even longer. With their longer life, his workers could perfect and hone their skill in the crafting of gifts, resulting in a proficiency which no human could rival. And so, the legend of Santa Claus had been born, a being that brought laughter and joy into the homes of all during the Christmas season by creating gifts and toys for good little girls and boys. Thinking back to when Nicholas had first become the being he was today, the grizzled man smiled amidst the darkness around him. The fond memories of how it all began always lifting his spirits, no matter the situation. "Sir." Nicholas stirred from his thoughts and turned to the sound of the familiar voice. Looking down, his eyes met those of Stefan, one of his first apprentices and oldest friends. Standing at a little over 1.5 meters tall, Stefan, despite the millennia since his birth, looked to be no older than 40 based on human standards. Apart from still possessing the same height he held as a child, Stefan's body was that of an adult in peak physical condition, a product of his years of experience and training. He stood at attention as he addressed Nicholas, his posture perfect and well suited to the set of heavy armor that he wore. A sturdy wooden bow was slung over his shoulder, with a quiver of mistletoe arrows sitting patiently at his side. The bow, Nicholas fondly remembered, had been crafted for Stefan as a Christmas gift from Nicholas himself. Perfectly symmetrical and tuned for pinpoint accuracy, it had been a welcome present for when Stefan had still been a human child attempting to hunt game for his family. It had since then been enhanced by Nicholas's magic, granting it extra power and range, and enhancing the bow so that rot would never take hold in the wood. It was with that bow that Stefan had felled both woodland beast and Krampuskin alike over the years, its reliability a proud mark of Nicholas's impeccable craftsmanship. At his other hip, Stefan carried a simple but lethal hand-wrought sword, this weapon crafted by Stefan's own hands rather than Nicholas's. Its make and design were perfect, and Nicholas smiled as his gaze lingered on the sword for a moment, feeling pride in Stefan for his skills as a weaponsmith. "Sir," Stefan repeated, "we are ready. You need only give the order." Nicholas smiled and gave a small shake of his head. His long gray beard swayed in the breeze with the motion. "My friend," Nicholas said in a gravelly voice that was weathered but still strong, "you and I have known each other for longer than Christmas itself has been celebrated. There is no need for such formality between us." At this, Stefan relaxed slightly and gave a small smile of his own. "Gotta keep some semblance of formality, Santa," he replied, this time using a more informal but still reverent title to address Nicholas by. "Can't have your army thinking that we have a breakdown in command structure." "My army." Thinking once again, Nicholas fell back into the memory of why Father Christmas commanded an army in the first place. As Nicholas recalled, it had begun on the 50th anniversary of the first Christmas celebration. Until then, Christmas had still been young, new, and welcome to all who celebrated it, and belief in Santa Claus had been in abundance. But like many good things, it had come to an end. That 50th Christmas, the mood was different. The winter that swept across the land had been especially harsh, and the harvest from the summer months had been grave and underwhelming. Families struggled to get by, and as a result, the Christmas spirit had been greatly subdued. Instead of coming together, the communities began to distrust each other and compete for resources, and it very quickly reminded Nicholas of how times had been before, when Krampus had still been in power. Gifts, if they were exchanged at all, were few and far between, with most only given in the hope of receiving something in return, and Nicholas remembered the pang in his heart when he had received so many letters asking for just basic necessities like food and warm clothing. Nicholas did all that he could to provide for all, but even with the aid of his magic, he was stretched too thin, as even he had his limits. The source of Nicholas's magical power was the very soul and spirit of humanity, but their despair had significantly drained him of magic that year, leaving him and his elves all vulnerable and weak. That Christmas, Krampus returned, the despair of humanity enough to strengthen him once again. He, as well as its vile minions, had set upon the populace, taking them the night and destroying the homes that he entered as he had so long ago. Humanity tried to defend against Krampus and his ilk, but the monsters and darkened elves that served the holiday demon were as numerous as they were dangerous. And further still, they were emboldened by Krampus's magic, stacking the deck ever against the humans. It was then that Nicholas decided to fight back, utilizing his skills and those of his elves to craft weapons that were subsequently imbued with his own magic to fight the hordes of Krampus. Though his magic was dangerously weak, Nicholas did what he could, and shortly after he had begun, Nicholas had successfully armed both himself and his workers. With great haste, he dispatched scouts to all corners of the world, instructing them to stand a vigilant watch for signs of Krampus's approach. These elves kept a keen eye especially on the children, as their level of holiday spirit remained the best form of early warning that Krampus would be coming soon. And each time that Krampus or his minions set upon a town or village, Nicholas was immediately notified by his scouts, and he would personally deploy an armed force to the location to help drive them away. Though the initial lack of training in the ways of war was quite evident and needed to be remedied, the forces of the North Pole held their own against Krampus's vile horde. And thanks to the timely response of Nicholas and his elves, very few disappearances happened that Christmas. The success of his deterring presence birthed a piece of the legend of Santa Claus that became lesser known and eventually forgotten over time. After the events of that 50th Christmas, it was decided that Nicholas would maintain his network of surveillance over the human civilizations of the world, and slowly but surely, Nicholas built up his web of informants so that no sign of Krampus would go unnoticed. He couldn't see Krampus while he was sleeping, but Nicholas would always know when he was awake. And with his surveillance system in place, Nicholas began to teach his elves not only the skills associated with carpentry and smithing, but also of warfare and how to wield a variety of weapons. Slowly but surely, the North Pole Army grew in formidability, learning from their mistakes and honing their skills and tactics each time Krampus awakened in the winter. Though they became extremely efficient at driving away Krampus's forces of darkness, Nicholas had always held reservations in his heart about his ever-constant battle against Krampus. The season of Christmas was supposed to be a time to put aside your weapons and come together, but he knew that if he and his elves stood down from the fight, then Krampus would slowly grow stronger and feed on humanity once again. Nicholas looked up past Stefan to the rest of the hill, the elevated land covered with the army of the North Pole. A force of nearly 500 elves stood in formation, each one carrying armor and weaponry similar to Stefan's, with each elf wielding a sword crafted personally by either themselves or Nicholas. The elves all stood at or a bit below Stefan's height, but each stood ready and trained for the battle to come. In addition to the main force, a small unit of cavalry gathered as well. 50 elves rode the backs of large armored polar bears, with 2 elves assigned to one steed. Designed to be a highly mobile force, one elf was trained to maneuver the bear, while the other was armed with a long pike in the back to skewer any enemies unfortunate enough to be standing in their way. A deadly unit on the battlefield, to be certain. Next to the cavalry force was a force of reindeer pilots. 200 elves mounted the reindeer in a similar fashion as the cavalry force. But instead of long pikes, the elves mounted in the rear carried longbows similar to Stefan's, each one highly trained in precision shooting and more than capable of dishing out deadly deliverance from above. Additionally, a force of Yeti had come as well, towering over the elves and their steeds as they stood upright on 2 legs. Though formerly natives of the Himalayan mountains, the large but peaceful creatures had been driven from their home long ago by the humans, so Nicholas had extended to them an offer to find a new home at the North Pole, which the Yeti had accepted with great gratitude. Though their community was separate from Nicholas's workshop, the Yeti would come by from time to time and assist with the daily operations alongside the elves, lending their strength and bulk to carry large pallets of gifts and toys to and from the workstations and staging them for delivery. Though the Yeti had insisted that they were only repaying Nicholas for allowing them to live at the North Pole, Nicholas still found ways to thank them for their efforts, mostly in the form of parcels of fresh meat seasoned with some of the finest spices known to man or beast. Though the Yeti insisted still that Nicholas need not provide such gifts, Nicholas never had to press the matter very far, as the food packages that he prepared for them were unrivaled in quality and taste. Nicholas always chuckled to himself when he saw their eyes light up during food deliveries to their community, and if he didn't know any better, he'd say that they had become quite addicted to his cooking. Though the Yeti had never been a part of Nicholas's army against Krampus, they were still fearsome warriors thanks to their incredible strength and surprising agility. Much like their ape-like cousins that dwelled in warmer climates, the Yeti possessed large hands and long arms that were perfect for climbing in the mountain ranges they were so familiar with. Nicholas's elves were often in awe of how they would swing from the rafters inside the workshop with such ease and fluidity, and they were even more surprised by just how gentle the Yeti could be, being able to handle fragile toys and glass with care despite their large hands and sharp claws. Despite the obvious advantage that the Yeti would provide among Nicholas's ranks, he was still regretful that he had needed to ask for their help tonight, given what he had seen and felt in the events leading up to this Christmas. However, Nicholas knew that he would need their help if he desired to see another one. And even then, it still might not be enough. Nicholas banished the thought as quickly as it came. He couldn't afford to think like that. He refused to think like that. Not now. Not ever. Santa? Stefan asked, tilting his head with concern. Nicholas looked over to his old friend in a moment of contemplation, then nodded his head. Very well, Stefan, Nicholas said with firm resolution. But first, I must address our forces. Stefan gave a smile and nodded in return before stepping out of Nicholas's way. Striding forward, Nicholas briefly paused to fetch something from his sleigh, which had been parked only a few meters away. Reaching down, Nicholas grunted as he hefted the substantial yet familiar weight of his own weapon of choice from the cargo section. A large 2-handed axe, double-bladed and perfectly crafted for Nicholas's height and build. Glancing over the axe for a moment and admiring its beauty, the bearded man then walked to where he could best be heard and seen, turning his head to give soft reassurances to the armored reindeer that pulled his sleigh. Once he finally made his way to the front, Nicholas came to a stop and surveyed his army once more, holding the axe in one hand and resting the butt of it in the deep snow at his feet. The elves, bears, and Yeti alike all stood a bit straighter as his gaze swept across their ranks. Then Nicholas spoke, using his magic to allow his voice to carry so that all could hear. As I look across all your faces, I see your confusion as to why we have gathered in such force on this Christmas Eve. I am sure many of you have guessed the answer, but allow me to officially clarify. All fell silent. Even the wind itself seemed to abate in anticipation for what Nicholas had to say. Krampus, our sworn enemy for as long as nearly all of you can remember, has set his forces upon this community behind us. Nicholas gestured with his axe behind him to the darkened town below. Despite our efforts to deter his advance, it seems that Krampus has been able to corrupt the spirit of Christmas here to a degree that we have not seen in a long time. The strength and number of his horde rivals, that which he possessed before the time of when Christmas was celebrated. We believe that if he is successful here tonight, he will have enough power to spread his vile darkness even further to larger towns and even cities, unless we stop him. The weight of Nicholas's words settled throughout his army, and he shared their feelings of shock and confusion as to how they had allowed this to happen. The truth, which Nicholas had decided not to share with his army, was that Krampus's forces had somehow uncovered the identity and location of Nicholas's informants within the community. Before a distress call could be sent out for help, Krampus's minions had slaughtered the elves and taken their place, sending false messages that the spirit of Christmas was alive and well within the town. In only one other instance had Nicholas's spies been compromised like that, and the results of that event had been disastrous. The entire village. Nicholas set his jaw, refusing to think more on that event. Something like that could not be allowed to happen again, not while he could still fight. Our initial reports show that Krampus controls a force down there larger than anything we have faced before. What's more is that I am sure that he knows we are coming. What awaits us down there will be the hardest battle we have ever fought, and though I believe we can emerge victorious, I know that it will not be without sacrifice. With that, I say that anyone who does not wish to partake may leave without consequence. I will not harbor ill will towards anyone who does not wish to stay. There was a long moment of silence, and then Nicholas felt his heart swell with pride as each of his troops set their own jaws and hardened their stances before his very eyes. Every single one of them still had faith in Nicholas, in the spirit of Christmas, and Nicholas knew in that moment that never in a million years would he find a finer set of individuals that he was willing to fight and possibly die alongside. Very well, he said with a steadfast and yet grateful tone, turning to Stefan as he did so. Commander, the floor is yours. Stefan stood to and cleared his throat before addressing the army. The only way to ensure that Krampus is purged from this town is to clear it street by street, he began. Battalions 2, 5, and 6 will prioritize the houses north of the river, while 1, 3, and 4 will take the houses to the south. Nicholas nodded in approval and took a step back, standing his axe up by its long haft and holding it easily in one hand. Unfortunately, many civilians are still trapped within their homes and buildings, Stefan continued, gesturing to the dark storm that blanketed the town below. That makes search and rescue our top priority. If you encounter any humans, contact our pilots immediately for extraction. Stefan gestured to the reindeer pilots as he spoke, who all nodded affirmingly. Each pilot was well versed in search and rescue operations, and each reindeer was strong enough to carry 3 to 4 humans at once if necessary. The Yeti and cavalry are to divide themselves up evenly among the battalions, such that no one unit is without support. They are not to remain with the main force, but must be ready to assist nearby. When not actively participating in rescue operations, air support can be provided upon request. The large force remained silent, still at attention and focused on the battle to come. Finally, should any of you encounter Krampus, immediately contact either Santa or myself. Do not attempt to engage him on your own. Report his location and accompanying force, then immediately retreat to a safe distance. Is that understood? Yes, sir, came the unified response from the hundreds of elves, their voices echoing off the hilltop and down into the valley below. Nicholas understood the necessity of Stefan's warning, as the physical prowess of Krampus was a frightening legend to the denizens of the North Pole. None had seen the demon's fighting ability up close and lived to tell the tale. Santa had lost many elves to the beast over the centuries, and despite the length of time they had warred against each other, Nicholas had only seen Krampus in the flesh a select few times. And even then, they had all been mere glimpses or from a distance, never up close. Nicholas's grip tightened on his battle axe at the thought. Despite Santa Claus being considered one of the most powerful beings on the planet, many of his elves held a nervous curiosity as to how he would fare if he were to duel Krampus in single combat. Even those who had witnessed Nicholas's skill in battle were still unsure of the outcome, and in truth, Nicholas shared in their uncertainty. He knew that his skills far outclassed any man or beast alive, but Krampus was said to be just as fearsome, if not more so than he, and with how diminished his magic was this season, Nicholas would be foolish to think that a duel with Krampus on this night might not cost him his life. Nicholas scowled and scolded himself once again for letting those thoughts enter his mind. He needed to focus on the here and now. Whatever came next, he would worry about it then. Stefan turned back to Nicholas and gave a small nod to indicate that he was finished, which Nicholas returned before hefting his axe and stepping forward once again. Despite his appearance as an older man, his figure stood imposingly before his troops and allies. Krampus thinks that he can stop us, that he can topple the spirit of Christmas forever by gaining a foothold in this town tonight. I do not know about any of you, but I will not stand idly by and let him get away with this. Now, who is with me? A cheer sounded from the ranks of elves, their voices strong, but not quite in unison. I said, "Who is with me?" This time, the cheering exploded into a loud roaring as elves, yeti, and beast alike let out a battle cry that shook the earth and momentarily blocked out the sound of the blizzard in the valley below. "Then march," Nicholas ordered, swiftly mounting his sleigh with an agility that defied his years. "Take to the streets, save this town, and let Krampus never forget that the spirit of Christmas lives on." A fresh bout of motivated cheering rolled across the land as the army of the North Pole set forth down the hill and into the valley below. The elves marched forward in a double-timed unison that maintained their formation while still displaying their swiftness, but the yeti and mounted cavalry eagerly charged down the hill and into the town below on a warpath. Nicholas had stirred the fires within them with his words, and he saw no fear on any of their faces as he took his place at the reins and roused his reindeer to attention. Mimicking his actions, the elf pilots immediately took to the skies, flying over the ground troops and assuming their own combat formations. With a small snap of the reins, Santa's own sleigh followed suit, the combined might of 8 magical reindeer easily lifting the vehicle up into the blackened sky. A glance to the front of the main force showed Stefan at the head, marching in time at a good distance forward of the bulk of elven soldiers. Nicholas watched as he caught back up to the main forces in the air, then frowned as the wind grew nastier still, as if in response to their approach. Pellets of ice began to fill the air, enough to cause him to squint as they pelted against his army like large needles. "Sir," came Stefan's voice over the howling gale, loudly and clearly echoing in Nicholas's mind through a magical link between them. "The weather is going to prevent us from getting into the town. We need a way to punch through. Our forces can't get much closer without casualties." Nicholas did not even bother answering. Instead, he shifted the reins into one hand and hefted his axe with the other. He willed his reindeer to pull to the front of the formation and drew the axe closer to his face. Summoning his will, Nicholas felt his magic flow through the axe as it had so many times before. Bright red light began to fill the runes of the axe head, and the tempered metal began to glow with both warmth and power. It was as though the axe itself was awakening from a deep slumber. Nicholas supposed that in a way it was as he was breathing the very life of Christmas into it once again. Rudolph was its name. It was a name that Nicholas had learned long ago when he had forged the weapon. So much magic had been used to enchant it that it had been bestowed with a will of its own, and though it never acted without its wielder, Nicholas had felt its will when he used it in battle. It was just as much alive as he was, and though it had only just awoken, he could feel its anticipation growing within the runed metal. "Old friend, I beseech you once again, guide my sleigh tonight." The axe responded like an eager hound set free from its leash, and Nicholas lifted the head high into the air as power burst forth from the blade. Potent red energy arced through the air and towards the storm wall before them, crackling as the warmth from the energy forcibly blasted away the cold wind from the storm. Where the energy struck, the blizzard relented, and the storm cowered as the light from the axe seemed to split the very heavens open to grant him access. Fresh cheers resounded from the pilots around him, and the main force below as the elves in formation broke into a tight run to pass through the makeshift gate before them. Now dash away, dash away, dash away all. So the gift giver had arrived at last. He and his little zealots were certainly persistent, but they did not have the strength to stop what had already been set in motion. No, they had only enough power to delay it, and even then, by perhaps only a year or so. The time to save their precious Christmas was long gone, as the forces that worked against them had managed to evade their notice all the way up until the move was made. Throughout centuries of planning and subtlety, by slowly corrupting their little holiday with greed and envy, they had unknowingly strengthened him once more, and by his victory here, the world would once again know his name. With his name came fear, and given just a few short seasons more, the time of winter would once again be synonymous with his wrath, and no one, especially their weak and withered father of Christmas, would be able to stop him. Nicholas growled and struck down another winged monstrosity with a blast of red light. Rudolph hummed with power and eagerness as he kept a swarm of airborne nightmares at bay. Harpies and darkened angels, all crafted of metal and which screeched and clawed at him and his reindeer pilots. And their ferocity and numbers were matched in kind by their ground-born counterparts below. Krampus had known that they were coming. Of that, there was no doubt. Shortly after passing through the storm front and into the suburban neighborhood, they had been met by a horde of Krampus's demonic creations. An army of dark elves carrying all sorts of crude weaponry and donning ghoulish masks had clashed against his own elves, and though Nicholas's troops were far more efficient and organized, they were vastly outnumbered. Their line held for now, but quite a few had already fallen to the superior numbers, their swords already well bloodied with the essence of their fallen foes. Krampus had also seen fit to augment his forces with his own vile and twisted creations, and his capacity for creation rivaled Nicholas's own. The only difference was that Nicholas built to bring cheer and happiness, while Krampus built to ultimately hurt and destroy. That fact was evident by the presence of large golems built of ice and snow on the battlefield, their size greater than that of the Yeti and their eyes glowing with a green maliciousness. Their grotesque claws of ice swatted at the reindeer pilots that circled above them, and their gargantuan feet stomped at the elves and polar riders that stabbed at them with their pikes. The variety of Krampus's forces did not end there, however, as he possessed an armored cavalry of his own. Large goats lumbered forward in heavy armor, their riders equipped much like Nicholas's own with bows and pikes that harassed any enemies that weren't trodden underfoot by their large hooves. Seeing a break in the attack from his winged harassers, Nicholas summoned his will, and Rudolph responded in force. Aiming the axe down toward an approaching line of large goats, another bright red blast of energy burst from the blade and rained down upon Krampus's foul cavalry, smiting many of the goats and their riders in just a few short seconds. Briefly winded from the exertion of his attack, Nicholas looked up just in time to see a mechanical abomination dive directly for him, rusted iron claws outstretched to gouge out his eyeballs. Nicholas grunted and swung his axe in a wide arc, cleaving the monstrosity in two just before it struck him. As the creature's now two halves fell onto the battlefield below, Nicholas heard Stefan reach out to him from a battlefield. "Sir, we are grossly outnumbered. Casualty reports are coming in from all sides. Orders, sir." Nicholas looked down to see Stefan dueling 4 dark elves at once, his sword expertly parrying their wild swings and riposting when the opportunity arose with deadly results. His commander was certainly holding his own, but looking down to the battlefield, he saw that despite his assistance, his forces were slowly but surely being overwhelmed. No matter how many dark elves or beasts his army felled, there were always more to take their place, whereas Nicholas's troops were becoming more obviously finite by the second. Crushingly, Nicholas began to see just how much the odds were stacked against him, and how close Christmas was coming to extinction. He knew that he himself would rather die than see Krampus's vision become reality once more, but his elves, he knew that they had all agreed to fight despite the odds, but to ask them all to sacrifice themselves? As Nicholas battled with the weight of his choice, he saw the line of the North Pole falter, dangerously close to breaking. And if it broke, Nicholas knew that all of them, elf, yeti, polar bear, and reindeer, would be slaughtered. He knew that each one of them would have given their life so that Christmas would last, but Nicholas could not find it in himself to allow them such a sacrifice. "Stefan," his throat was dry and his words were heavy with weariness. "Order an immediate retreat." Nicholas's voice was drowned out all of a sudden by a thunderous boom that sounded from the battlefield below. Momentarily forgetting about his half-spoken order, Nicholas looked down upon the battlefield to see the last vestiges of a bright blue light fade into nothingness. The source of the light had appeared perfectly between the armies of Krampus and Nicholas, effectively halting the flow of battle with its sudden and insistent appearance. Even the airborne warriors paused their altercation to take in the sight on the icy ground below. As the light faded, Nicholas looked down to see a shadowy silhouette take its place, the darkness of the blizzard obscuring the noticeably bulky form that had been thrust upon the battlefield. As his eyes adjusted, Nicholas saw the form take the shape of an armored, bipedal humanoid, though not much else could be discerned from its appearance due to the distance between Nicholas and it. The armored figure slowly turned its head in observance of the frozen battle before it. Strangely, it did not seem perturbed by the two armies that it was now enclosed between, which struck Nicholas as odd, as certainly any normal human, at least he assumed that the armored figure was human, would be somewhat startled by suddenly appearing in the middle of a Yuletide skirmish. And yet, this newcomer stood almost stoically, as though it was anticipating someone else to make the first move. In that moment, Nicholas's magic spoke to him, whispering of an ancient and deadly force even older than Krampus, and even Rudolph seemed to vibrate with excitement, which only increased Nicholas's sense of anticipation for what came next. As if on cue, a foul harpy made of wood and steel chose to dive-bomb the figure at that moment, its metallic beak squawking with hatred and animosity. Furling its wings in a harsh squealing of metal, the vile beast dove toward the strange humanoid. But before it could outstretch its lengthy claws in anticipation, the figure had moved with a blurred speed that even Nicholas could barely follow. Drawing a strange weapon from thin air, the figure fired a bright beam of red light at the monster, the beam striking the automaton with such force that its metallic body was wrenched apart by the blast. As both its wings, its head, and its feet separated from its main body with the force of the impact, Nicholas watched in a state of suspended awe as its limbs began to decay into dust. As they did so, the wood and metal crumbling into ash before they had the chance to hit the ground. There was a moment of brief silence, hardly a breath in real time. Then the figure seemingly came to a conclusion. With another bout of blurred movement that Nicholas could barely follow, the figure launched itself against the forces of Krampus, drawing another weapon and opening fire on the dark elves that were closest to it. Their dying screams seemed to ignite the tide of battle once more, and Nicholas roused his troops by crying out and summoning another beam of energy from Rudolph, using it this time to chain destructive energy through the airborne ghouls that littered the sky. His attack not only felled numerous demons, but also bathed the battlefield in a dull red glow, which struck his troops from their stupor and motivated them to follow in their leader's footsteps. They launched themselves anew at the enemy, striking with renewed vigor at the ankles of the vile golems and finding acute accuracy to shoot down the hordes in the sky. As Nicholas watched, an exceptionally motivated Yeti launched itself onto the shoulders of a snow golem. Using its bestial strength, the Yeti ripped the golem's head clean from its shoulders, and though the golem still continued to swing about wildly without its head, the combined efforts of other Yeti and the Polar Riders brought it down mere moments after. "Sir," Nicholas heard Stefan's voice from below. "Who? Or rather, what is that thing?" Nicholas knew that Stefan spoke only of the mysterious figure below, and like his friend, Nicholas had no idea as to the origins of their temporary ally. Its strength was certainly a welcome addition to his forces, but beyond that. Before Nicholas could voice his own ignorance of the situation, he was struck by the sudden existence of another and far more sinister force not too far away. Instinctively turning towards that direction, Nicholas's eyes furrowed as he recognized the signature of this recently observed entity. "Krampus!" "Stefan!" Nicholas called out as he hefted his axe and shifted his weight. "Krampus is close. I'm moving towards the location now. See to it that I am not followed by Krampus's forces or our own." Nicholas barely heard Stefan's frantic protests as he then hurtled over the side of his sleigh and into the cold, empty air beneath. For a few peaceful moments, Nicholas closed his eyes as he treasured the strangely soothing sound of the wind rushing past his ears. Then his eyes snapped open, and he arched his body to come into a proper landing position. Reindeer pilots and Krampuskin whooshed past as he drew closer to the ground, the battle in the sky continuing to rage on without him. Using his magic, Nicholas coated his body with a protective shield, and in the next second, he hit the ground hard. White snow powder and ice chips blossomed in a fine cloud from where he had landed, but none of that was of concern to Nicholas, as he only had eyes for his foe. Absent-mindedly, Nicholas swung his axe in a wide sweep, decapitating 3 dark elves as he did so. The poor fools did not even see their death coming. With a mask of determination, Nicholas began carving his way through the odious hordes of Krampus's army, his eyes not straying for even a moment in search of his goal. A large goat approached him from behind with preparations to crush him beneath its hooves, but 5 Yeti fell upon it in the next moment, toppling it off balance as they clawed and bit into its armored but vulnerable hide. Nicholas broke into a jog to continue forward, but a golem suddenly stepped into his path, and he had to crane his neck to see the unsavory green that glowed within its eye sockets. Nicholas made to strike with Rudolph, but the golem suddenly jolted where it stood, as though it had been struck by invisible lightning. The large animated vessel arched its head in a bellow of agony, then fell to its knees. Nicholas held his axe at the ready, but it proved unnecessary, as the green light in the golem's eyes flickered and died shortly after, the beast's form falling face first into the snowy earth and going completely still. Gazing up, Nicholas saw none other than the mysterious stranger appear before him, a large chainsaw embedded to the hilt in the back of the golem. The stranger wrenched the chainsaw from the golem, then fixed its helmeted gaze onto Nicholas for the first time. In that moment, Nicholas knew for a fact that this entity was not of this world. Its strength was evidently overwhelming, But Nicholas could sense a certain sort of indomitability from beneath the armor that surpassed himself and even that of Krampus. If it had existed in this world before, there was no way that it would have escaped his notice for so long. And yet, despite his revelation regarding this newcomer, Nicholas found it to still be an enigma of great degree. For such a being this powerful to have suddenly arrived on this world could certainly not be by accident. Surely it had come with a purpose in mind, and Nicholas was extremely wary that its intentions would not align with his own. There was a moment of silence as the two supernatural beings examined each other. Then a metallic voice spoke from the armored suit. "Hello, I am Vega. I'm AI housed within this suit. The man you see before you is known as the Doomslayer." Nicholas frowned briefly at the abrupt introduction, but quickly shrugged it off and offered a brief nod of his head, despite the continuing carnage around him. If this Doomslayer was a force of evil, then he would have to be dealt with at a later time. For right now, Nicholas had no choice but gamble on his intent with Christmas itself. "Vega, Doomslayer. My name is Nicholas. I am fighting to save the world from being enveloped by a great evil on this Christmas. Despite your sudden and wholly unknown arrival, I am afraid I must beg your assistance, as I fear my forces can no longer overcome this evil unaided. Will you help me? We do not yet know the intentions of either of your armies." The voice known as Vega replied kindly. "However, it appears that these forces you oppose harbor ill will towards civilians. That is sufficient to see us temporarily allied." Nicholas shared an intense look with the Doomslayer for a moment, then cautiously lowered his guard, seeing as it was enough to trust this strange human for now. The Doomslayer seemed to trust Nicholas as well, though it seemed as though the Slayer had innate sense for such things. "Then I owe you a debt beyond measure," Nicholas said before gesturing in the direction that Krampus's evil was emanating from. "Krampus, vile enemy of Christmas, has made himself known not far from here. I must face him personally, but I beseech your assistance in clearing the way." The Doomslayer followed his gaze, taking note of the swarm of Krampus's minions that stood between them and where the holiday demon's aura seemed to be emanating from. The scores of enemies did not seem to deter him in the slightest, and Nicholas watched as the Slayer produced a pump-action shotgun seemingly from thin air and cocked it once, loading a round into the chamber. The sound itself resonated an unnaturally large amount of intimidation, even to Nicholas, and as if to set the scene further, a sudden flash of lightning struck the snowy ground adjacent to where the two of them stood, startling Nicholas with the clap of thunder that followed. As the flash from the lightning blinked away, Nicholas noted with a significant degree of surprise that a large canine-looking creature had appeared, its jet-black fur ablaze with some form of otherworldly fire that did not seem to deter the creature at all. The four-legged animal took notice of Nicholas with a pair of glowing amber eyes, and it gave him a few experimental sniffs with its skinless snout before disregarding him, seemingly in favor of the hordes of Krampuskin that lay before them. "I believe we will be able to entertain your request without issue," Vegas said from within the Slayer's armor. "However, I must request in return that your own forces do not target the Slayer or the Hellhound, as they may mistake us as enemies." Nicholas nodded and spoke to his forces telepathically through his magic, informing them of the two new additions of their forces. Strict orders were given to remain an ample distance from them as well, for if this Hellhound possessed even a fraction of the fighting prowess the Doomslayer did, then it was likely that they both would very quickly become the center of attention in this battle, meaning that they would likely be found where the concentration of Krampus's forces were the thickest. Nicholas's prediction proved to be all too accurate in the ensuing carnage, as the Slayer and his canine companion tore into Krampus's forces with such vigor that the armies of the North Pole had to struggle to keep up. The two of them moved with enough speed and efficiency to be considered equivalent to an army of their own, and many of Nicholas's forces went several minutes without directly clashing with Krampus's own army, as the Slayer and the Hellhound's wake of destruction advanced at an unparalleled rate. Nicholas had even watched in awe as Stefan made to strike a killing blow against the Dark Elf by decapitating it, only for the warped creature's head to explode from a well-placed shot from one of the Slayer's numerous weapons. Stefan's blade swept swiftly through the empty air where the Dark Elf's head had been moments before, and the seasoned veteran had stood stunned for a brief moment before he had realized what had happened. Stefan then turned to give the Slayer an angry glare at having his kill stolen, only to find that the Slayer had already moved on and was currently in the process of snapping a gargantuan Yule goat's horn from its head in order to impale it. Even Nicholas had to push himself in order to keep the Hellhound and the Slayer's pace. To say that the Slayer was keeping his promise to clear the way was an understatement, and with Nicholas's own skill in battle added to the mix, the three of them had punched a hole no less than 30 meters wide in the vile sea of their holiday foes. Wind and ice only grew in its torrent as they plowed forward towards the location of Krampus, the weather directly affected by the mere presence of the demon of winter. It was as though the earth itself stood against them that night. But Nicholas continued on still, his spirit emboldened by his loyalty to Christmas itself and the aid of the Slayer. Krampus's own forces had shifted their attention mostly to them now, as it seemed that their ultimate goal was to prevent anyone from breaking through their line and reaching their vile master. Their efforts amounted to little difference, however, as the combined will of Nicholas, the Hellhound, and the Doomslayer refused to be denied on that Christmas Eve. It was only with a few more minutes of fighting that they broke through the line and to the other side of the swarm. All around and behind them, the forces of the North Pole still clashed ferociously against the enemies of Christmas, both sides zealous in their pursuit of victory. At the sight, Nicholas hesitated, his desire to stay and fight alongside his forces temporarily overpowering the need to face Krampus. The moment quickly passed, however, as Nicholas knew that he had his own battle still yet to be fought. Looking over, Nicholas moved to get the attention of the Doomslayer, who was embattled with a twisted amalgamation of metal and hate. The automaton was vaguely human-like, though it stood at least 3 meters tall, and its metallic features were distorted in representation of the perverted nature of its creator. Numerous arms that ended in blades and claws all struck out against the Slayer, and a skeletal face with razor-sharp teeth the size of human fingers gnashed rapidly. Nicholas took a step forward to assist, but somewhere in his mind, he knew that his help would not be required. The Slayer proved him right yet again by catching one of the wrists of the mechanical abomination as it lashed out at him. The arm itself ended in a circular saw that screeched as it spun, but the Slayer paid it no mind. Balling his other fist tightly, the armored human brought his forearm down hard onto the metallic appendage, keeping his steadfast grip on the automaton's wrist. The force of the blow tore the robot's arm in two, but before it could screech in anguish and fury, the Slayer brought his fist back up and backhanded the creature across its steel jaw. Metal flew into the air as the lower half of the creature's face came free from the rest of its being, and the force of the blow spun it around, presenting its back to the Slayer. There was no hesitation from the armored man, and a moment later, he had discarded the half-arm, still clenched in his fist, and had mounted the creature's back. Reaching up, he dug his gauntlets deep into the monstrosity's anatomy where its head met its shoulders. A high-pitched metallic squealing pierced the night air over the other sounds of battle as the Slayer then pulled the head free, taking with it most of the robot's spinal column and ribcage as he did so. He turned his gaze to Nicholas at last after that, the still twitching and sparking pieces of the automaton falling to the ground as nothing more than scrap metal. Nearby, the Hellhound continued in its fury, scattering the dark elves as they attempted to flee from its hellacious onslaught. "It is time," Nicholas said. "I must go forward alone. I am in no position to do so, but I must ask of you one last thing." Neither the Slayer nor Vega spoke, silently prompting Nicholas to continue. "Please ensure that I am not followed by neither Krampus's or my own forces. I will not further risk any of their lives by having them attempt to battle Krampus with me." The Slayer waited for a beat, then gave a singular resolute nod with his head, and though Nicholas knew that the Slayer had already agreed to honor his final request, he still extended his arm in a gesture of gratitude, and the Slayer returned the gesture by firmly grasping his forearm in his gauntlet hand. "If I should fall, promise me that you will not let the Krampus leave this place. Whatever happens to me, it all ends tonight." Then, with their unspoken agreement made, the two of them turned away, the Doomslayer back towards the battle that still raged on, and Nicholas towards the darkness beyond, steeling himself for what would be his first and last confrontation with Krampus. Millennia of war and suffering all coming to a head on this final Christmas Eve. Omi stood resolutely in front of the fireplace, its flames of warmth and comfort long gone as a chill colder than any she'd ever felt before began to set in. He was here, Krampus. Despite Omi's best efforts to keep the spirit of Christmas alive within the hearts of her family, he had still returned, coming once again to steal away those who had forgotten the true meaning of this time of year, just like he'd done all those years ago. Sorrow threatened to overwhelm Omi as she remembered that fateful night from her childhood, how her village had lost their hope in almost the exact same way that her family had now, and how Krampus had come and taken them all. He had swept them all away on that one fateful Christmas Eve. All but Omi. He had left her behind as a reminder of what would happen when belief is forgotten and the Christmas spirit dies. And now, he had come again, and all that was left to do was to face him. All that Omi could hope to salvage from her failure was to delay Krampus just enough so that her family could escape. It had been a desperate hope, but it was the only one that she had left. Krampus had stolen all the rest. Wind howled through the broken living room window as a deep and vile roar sounded from somewhere outside the house, and lightning flashed and thunder rolled as a blizzard from hell raged on outside. As if it were even possible, the temperature dropped further still, and out of the corner of her eyes, Omi could see frost beginning to coalesce on the surface of a snow globe sitting on the mantelpiece. The lights on the wreath and holly flickering in a desperate attempt to stay lit against the elements as well. A loud crack suddenly resonated throughout the house, startling Omi and causing her to take a half step back and look up at where the wall above the fireplace met the ceiling. For a moment, there was nothing save for the wind and thunder. Then a large crack appeared in the drywall, sprouting from somewhere above and slowly beginning to work its way down to the fireplace. The wall bulged outward as the crack deepened, the chimney struggling to contain the size of the demon that was descending down its length. Omi watched in a mournful silence, her mind having already accepted her fate as loose bricks fell from somewhere in the chimney and clattered into the hearth. The demon had not yet emerged, but Omi could hear its deep and raspy breathing echo outward from the fireplace, its odious noise combined with the cracking and breaking of the wall as Krampus forced his way down. The first thing she saw were his claws. Long taloned hands emerged from above the lip of the hearth and grasped at the edges for purchase. Like long, pale spider legs, the hands pulled the rest of a massive body out from within the chimney. Two massive hooves landed on the hardwood floor with a loud crack, and before her eyes, the gargantuan form of Krampus slowly began unfurling himself to rise to his full height. His hulking body was draped in heavy layers of pelts and furs, all dark red as if dyed with blood. Long chains and rusty bells clanked with each step, wrapped about his body like a sash. Omi steeled herself to meet his gaze, but paused when she felt the pleasant warmth of a gloved hand on her shoulder. Slowly, the elder woman turned her head to meet the kindest pair of eyes she had ever seen. An old and weathered man looked back at her with a kind warmth behind his eyes that was powerful enough to banish the chill of the blizzard outside. It was a look that reminded Omi so much of a kind parent, who would somehow always make things okay, no matter how bad they seemed to get. The old man greeted her as though she were an old friend, and though Omi would never know how, she somehow still felt somewhere deep in her bones that he had known her long before this night. And with a startling realization, she realized that she had met him once before. She had just forgotten who this man truly was. "Wynaxman," Omi whispered, her aging face lifting into a genuine smile for the first time in days. The man nodded and returned the smile. It was warm enough to melt even the coldest of ice. He reassured her and called her by her real name, speaking her first language with such fluency that he could have been mistaken for one of the elders in her village. The moment was fleeting, however, and a deep and twisted growl shook Omi to her core and caused her smile to falter as her eyes jolted back to Krampus, who had fully emerged from the chimney and was now menacingly approaching the two of them. Omi could not see the demon's face behind the cruel bearded mask it wore, but its eyes pierced into her soul. Goat-like irises seemingly seeing right through her and drawing all of her pain and suffering to the surface. Next to her, St. Nicholas's face grew hard. He briefly set down the large axe he had been carrying, then shouldered off his large red cloak and placed it around Omi's shoulders. The chill from Krampus was immediately banished once again, the feeling of the cloak akin to sitting next to a roaring fire. It even smelled like roasting chestnuts, and despite how heavy it was, Omi somehow only felt lighter with it on. St. Nicholas then asked Omi to exit the house, assuring her that the cloak would keep her warm and safe from the storm and Krampus's evil minions. He gave her a direction, assuring her that her family had been directed that way as well. His words were firm, but with an overarching calmness, and yet, Omi still hesitated for the briefest moments. The hulking beast that was Krampus looked so angry and dangerous, and though St. Nicholas did not look weak by any means, for him to face a demon such as this alone. The old man turned and gave Omi a smile and another reassuring nod, and though she still feared to leave him alone with Krampus, Omi turned and strode from the house, hastily making her way out into the storm. The wind thrashed at her and blew ice and sleet everywhere, but the cloak remained warm all the same. It even seemed to lessen the wind around Omi as she hurried down the snow-covered street. Nicholas's eyes narrowed as he truly took in Krampus for the first time. To call this entity fearsome would not even begin to describe the menace that emanated from Krampus's very essence. Though Nicholas himself was one of the most powerful beings on the planet, even he still felt a chill down his spine as Krampus gazed upon him for the first time as well. The two were silent for a moment. Then a deep rumbling laughter sounded from behind Krampus's mask, and Nicholas grit his teeth as the demon unshouldered one of its chains and held it easily within its massive and gnarled claws. At one end of one chain sat a large barbed hook, and at the other was a large ironclad bell, likely used as a blunt striking object against anything that stood in Krampus's way. The beast's movements were slow and deliberate, but Nicholas had lived long enough to know better. Krampus was not to be underestimated, and to do so in any account would mean death. Nicholas hefted Rudolph and readied himself against his sworn enemy, focused and sharp. "Your evil Instinite, Krampus." There was a pause, then another deep laugh from Krampus, and Nicholas barely had time to respond before the beast rushed forward, swinging its chain at blinding speed towards his head. Author note: so, as many have already deduced, this arc exists in two parts. This mainly exists because I came slightly unhinged and wrote this story in a whopping 26,000 words. This, my friends, is once or again a record, and I'm thinking that I'm going to have to dial it back eventually, lest my chapters eventually grow to the lengths of entire stories on their own. That being said, there was much delicious lore to play with when it came to this story thanks to the director of the movie, Michael Dougherty. Did you know he wrote a comic book to accompany the movie? So, for the first time ever, I split the chapter into two parts, which will be released one after the other. Now, as many of you have also noticed, I deviated quite a bit from how the movie depicts Krampus and his motives. But I'd like to think that even the holiday demon whose job is to punish naughty children might have some ulterior motives. Either way, please let me know what you think by bullying me or commending me in the comments, as I absolutely love hearing feedback on how my work is going so far. I will see you all in Part 2. ImpulsiveWeaver. Chapter 38, Krampus, Part 2. Author note: Merry Christmas Eve, and welcome everyone to Part 2 of Universal Doom's very own holiday special. I hope everyone enjoys the thrilling conclusion of this story arc. Enjoy. I own nothing. Stefan drove his blade through the neck of a dark elf, silencing the creature's screeches of battle and swiftly ending its life. The armies of the North Pole, thanks to the assistance of the strange armored figure and his demonic wolf, had broken Krampus's line completely, and now the remaining forces were in complete disarray as Stefan and his companions tore through them like a whirlwind. As with on the ground, the air forces were slowly turning the tide as well. Stefan had been able to organize a few regiments into ground-to-air sharpshooters with their enchanted bows and arrows, offering much-needed aid to the outnumbered reindeer pilots above. Looking now, Stefan could see that Krampus's forces were now diminishing rapidly, and that the armies of the North Pole were no longer fighting back from the brink of utter defeat. It was time to complete the mission they had come here for. Battalions 3 and 6 reform our offensive line and continue our assault against the main force. All other units regroup and begin clearing the streets. All Yeti and cavalry units provide additional support. Don't let any Krampuskin escape. Stefan's voice was carried and amplified by an amulet imbued with Nicholas's magic, and the entire army of the North Pole heard him as clearly as if he were speaking directly into their ears. A battle cry went up from all of their forces, and Stefan looked on with pride as the army immediately reorganized itself to comply with the orders he had given. The only unknown remaining was that of the armored stranger, or Doomslayer, as Nicholas had said his name was. Stefan had consciously refrained from directly giving the armored man any orders, as not only was Stefan doubtful that the Doomslayer would follow them, but he also had an inkling that given the seemingly bottomless wealth of combat experience that the armored human possessed, he would automatically position himself where he was most effective, and therefore not require any orders at all. Stefan's hunch was proven correct as the Slayer and his canine companion swiftly moved to flank the remaining bulk of Krampus's forces from behind. Together, the two of them fought with the strength of armies, and their forceful advance drove back Krampus's forces with ease and directly towards the offensive line of Nicholas's army. Sandwiched between the two forces, Stefan watched as the enemies of Christmas began to drop like snowflakes in a thick winter storm. Piles of bodies and metal and wood all began to amass as they were cut down in swathes, staining the thick blanket of snow on the street a deep red. They were winning. The thought filled Stefan with hope of indescribable proportions. Victory had been snatched from the very jaws of defeat on this night, and though Stefan knew that it was largely in part due to the arrival of the Doomslayer, he still felt overwhelming pride in the vigor and training that had allowed the armies of Christmas to last long enough until the Slayer and Hellhound had appeared. They had been prepared to fight to the last, and Stefan looked on with a genuine smile on his face as a trio of elfish soldiers fended off a small swarm of monstrous stuffed animals with razor-sharp teeth and beady eyes. The cruel imitations of the toys made in Nicholas's workshop were feral and many, but the elves fought precisely and determinately, saving the life of the downed polar bear mount that the abominations had begun to tear their claws and teeth into. Stefan's gratification soared as the bear was helped to its feet once the immediate threat was past. In the back of his mind, he felt a twinge of disappointment that Nicholas was not there to witness the sheer grandeur of his army in this moment. Nicholas. With a cold jolt, Stefan remembered exactly why Nicholas was not there to witness this moment. Whirling around, Stefan looked to the direction he felt Krampus's evil aura emanating from. It was as twisted and cold as ever to feel Krampus so close, But unlike when they had first arrived in the town, it now pulsed and ebbed with the edge of rage, indicating that Krampus was embattled against something or someone. Nicholas. Stefan set his jaw, remembering the strict orders he had been given to bar any advance of Krampus's forces should they attempt to follow Nicholas in his attempt to face their master. And he unfortunately remembered that he was to halt any attempt by the armies of the North Pole to follow as well. Stefan knew that Nicholas had given those orders with the express intent to protect them from Krampus's wrath. But with the demon's entire army almost defeated, Stefan couldn't just sit here and wait while Nicholas faced the nightmare of Krampus on his own. Despite how powerful Father Christmas was, Stefan was not blind to the fact that his magic was weakened this year. And Krampus was without a doubt far stronger than he had been for a long time. Stefan's heart wrenched in his chest, partly in anger at Nicholas, at ordering them all to remain behind while he foolishly challenged Krampus himself. This victory meant nothing if Nicholas died tonight, and Stefan felt his loyalties clash within him as he struggled. His desire to protect one of his oldest friends warred with his steadfast determination to respect the orders he'd been given, for despite the dismal odds of survival Nicholas possessed against Krampus, Stefan knew that the odds of himself surviving were even worse, even with an entire regiment of elves and Yeti at his back. Additionally, though Nicholas would never admit it to any of them, attempting to face Krampus with a unit of elves to support him would only serve as a distraction, as he would have to divide his attention between battling Krampus and protecting his support. Stefan ground his teeth at the thought, and he cursed himself for not being better so that Nicholas would not have to watch out for him if he joined him in his battle. If only they had. Stefan's eyes snapped to the doomed slayer in the next moment, and before he knew what he was doing, he charged into the remaining hordes of Krampuskin, swinging his blade in broad strokes to clear a path to the slayer. At first, his advance was quick and aggressive, but he had acted without thinking, and soon realized that he had separated himself from the main force, and was now entirely surrounded by dark elves and mechanical abominations. In a second, Stefan was forced onto the defensive as dark creatures pressed in on him from all sides, recognizing him as the commander of the North Pole Army. They knew despite their imminent oblivion that killing him would at least demoralize the North Pole Army, and at most it would cause them to falter, opening up the opportunity for a counterattack. Stefan had been so blinded by his desire to reach the Slayer that he had not been thinking rationally, and such a mistake would now likely cost him his life. The moment was averted, however, by the sudden arrival of the Hellhound in a flash of lightning and a clap of thunder, far louder and brighter than any of the lightning that arced through the sky above. The light heralding its arrival had barely disappeared before the creature fell upon the nearest enemies, tearing their limbs from their bodies with its powerful jaws and crushing their bones with the weight behind its forceful tackles. Before Stefan could recover and help the creature, however, the hound turned its attention back to him and leapt to his side, clamping its jaws firmly around his wrist before teleporting them both away with another flash of light. Stefan screwed his eyes shut at the sudden brilliance, then blinked rapidly as he emerged back onto the battlefield once more, though this time at the edge of the remaining forces of Krampus instead of in the center. His head felt dizzy, and he struggled for a moment to keep his balance as the world seemed to tilt ever so slightly. Thankfully, the disorientation cleared up quickly, and Stefan met the hound's impatient gaze for a moment before nodding his thanks. The canine snorted once before returning to the fray, and Stefan made to join as well when he saw the Doomslayer just a few meters away, the automatic rifle in his hands cutting down numerous Krampuskin in a hail of gunfire. "Doomslayer," Stefan called, running up beside him with his blade, already in motion to strike at the nearest enemies. "St. Nicholas cannot fight and win against Krampus alone. We have the situation here under control now. You gotta help him." The Slayer did not turn his head away from the carnage, but Stefan was sure that the armored man had heard him all the same. Within the Slayer's armor, a metallically cordial voice spoke up. It was a request of St. Nicholas that neither his nor Krampus's forces be allowed to follow him. It said, the voice calm and collected and not at all what Stefan had expected the Slayer to sound like. And before Stefan could open his mouth to rebut, the voice continued. "We, however, are not members of either side." There was a beat of silence. Then the Doomslayer turned and gave Stefan a nod, signifying that they were in agreement. Stefan set his jaw and nodded in return, as there were no words to properly convey the gratitude he felt in that moment. "We will depart immediately." Then, before Stefan had any further chance to act, the hound had once again taken hold of him in its teeth. Lightning flashed in his face once again, and this time, Stefan had barely emerged from the teleportation before he collapsed onto one knee, the feeling of teleporting twice in such a short amount of time causing his head to spin rapidly now. Stefan fought back the urge to vomit as lightning struck once more with a loud boom, though he remained where he was this time. A few seconds more, and Stefan felt well enough to stand once again, assisted by a few nearby elfish soldiers who had seen him arrive. As his vision cleared, Stefan looked around to catch sight of the hound, but saw no sign. It was likely that the second flash and boom had been the flaming canine leaving him behind. "Commander," came the voice of Helga, lieutenant of the 3rd Battalion. "The armored human is breaking off his engagement, and the demonic wolf has gone with him. Do we continue to press the attack?" Stefan's bearing as a commander took over as he righted himself completely. "Press forward," he commanded. "The Slayer is moving to assist St. Nicholas. Make sure no forces of Krampus follow him. Cut off their retreat." Taking up his sword yet again, Stefan let out a battle cry and led their charge anew against the broken line of Krampuskin, determined not to let a single one escape their wrath tonight. Nicholas skidded backwards, the snow and ice providing little traction as he struggled to remain upright. His momentum finally stopped when his back crashed hard against a large minivan, and the older man grunted in pain but refused to stop even for a moment, for if he did, he was dead. The battle with Krampus had quickly outgrown the house they had first faced off in. The power share between the two of them was so great that such a small space only served to confine them from using the full extent of their abilities. Though in hindsight, the house did not really do anything to confine them, as their battle had caused the building to collapse mere minutes after their battle began. Out in the open, the two opposing entities were free to use as much of their power as they saw fit without restraint, and Nicholas was now witnessing firsthand just how much power Krampus truly possessed. The holiday demon outclassed Nicholas in both strength and speed, and Nicholas now sported a few glancing injuries thanks to his underestimation of both of those characteristics. The hook, bell, and chain that Krampus was using as his main weapon often could only be seen as a blur for how fast it swung through the air, leaving Nicholas mostly reliant on his combat experience to guess where the weapon landed rather than react to it. In truth, it was Nicholas's superior usage of his weapon and his surroundings that had kept him alive thus far, as despite Krampus's physical might, the beast still lacked discipline and finesse with his weapon and style of fighting. His movements were fast, but they were clunky and imprecise, and Krampus's lack of experience fighting enemies of his caliber made itself known in how he conducted himself in one-on-one combat. Movements were telegraphed, advantages were unknowingly given up, and usage of the terrain and environment were next to none when it came to Krampus. And it was thanks to these specific flaws that Nicholas had even managed to land a few blows of his own against the vile monster. Some sort of blackish blood dripped from a wound that Nicholas imparted on Krampus's right shoulder, Rudolph striking true and cutting deep into the beast's flesh. The howl it had unleashed when wounded had been almost deafening to Nicholas, and unfortunately, Krampus had retaliated before he had gotten clear. A large claw wrapped in chains had struck Nicholas forcefully, jarring his body and sending him flying through the air, his form landing hard on the ice after crashing through the wall of another house. The blow had cracked quite a few of Nicholas's ribs, making it painful to breathe, but Nicholas rose even still, his conviction to save Christmas making him forget his wounds. Nicholas dodged to the left, just in time as the heavy iron bell at the end of Krampus's chain came down hard onto the minivan he had been leaning up against. The metal chassis screamed and caved in almost too eagerly to the force behind the attack, and the vehicle slumped and fell inward as the weapon crushed it completely. It was hardly another moment before Krampus swung again, and this time, Nicholas had no choice but to deflect the blow with Rudolph, as the attack came too quickly for him to dodge. His body shuddered as the heavy bell clanged off the axe head, but Nicholas pressed forward as Krampus swung the bell for another strike. This time, Nicholas had ample time to duck under the attack, and he gripped Rudolph in two hands before raising it above his head to bring it down hard onto Krampus's form. His axe blade met the cold iron of Krampus's hook as the demon blocked the attack, and the burst of power that resulted from the two weapons colliding blasted outward, kicking up snow and ice as though it had been blown by an incredibly strong tempest. Nicholas grunted as his swing was halted, and in their sudden proximity, he could clearly see the goat-like eyes glowing behind Krampus's mask, which was in cruel imitation of Nicholas's own visage. Anger flared through him, and Nicholas broke the lock before spinning to gain momentum to strike again. His anger giving him a burst of speed, Nicholas feinted a strike from the side, and Krampus took the bait, raising his hook in preparation for another block. At the last moment, Nicholas changed the direction of the swing, instead swinging widely from underneath with enough force to split Krampus's head open from the chin up if it landed. The demon's speed saved it from certain death, and Krampus jerked his head back just in time to dodge the strike. The blade missed the monster's face by barely an inch, but it did not miss his mask, and Nicholas watched as the false face split in two from Rudolph's enhanced blade. The two have sailed into the air in opposite directions, and Krampus howled and staggered back a step, clutching his face with one of its chain-wrapped claws. Nicholas knew that now would be the time to press the advantage while the monster was distracted, but something held him in place. Whether it was shock or anger or curiosity, he would never know, but it compelled Nicholas to wait as Krampus slowly lowered the gnarled fingers that had clutched at his face. Nicholas's heart almost seized with dread as he gazed upon the true face of the enemy of Christmas for the first time. It was a description he could not put into words, as to try and give form to the horror that had been revealed was an impossible task. Wrong. That was the word that Nicholas decided was the best description of what he saw before him. Everything about it was wrong. It shouldn't have existed, for it was so much more cruel and so much more malignant than anything else that existed on this earth. Nicholas did not have a chance to think more on the subject before Krampus bellowed and charged, swinging the hook and bell simultaneously now in its own fit of rage. In a flash, both ends of the chain were on a direct path to Nicholas's head, and by sheer instinct alone, Nicholas raised Rudolph and stopped their advance. Both the bell and hook wrapped tightly around the haft, and though Nicholas held on as tightly as he could, Krampus's strength prevailed, and Rudolph was wrenched from his grasp. With a triumphant howl, the beast flung the axe away, the deep red glow fading and then disappearing entirely as the veil of the blizzard enshrouded it. Nicholas tried to move away, but Krampus charged once more, driving headfirst into Nicholas's midsection with an incredibly powerful headbutt. The hard and scored surface of Krampus's horns broke whatever ribs of Nicholas's that had already been cracked, and the breath was forced from his lungs as he flew backward from the force of the blow. For numerous seconds, Nicholas experienced weightlessness as the wind whistled in his ears, and then he gave an agonized shout as his back slammed hard into the side of the snowplow. His wounds exploded in blossoms of anguish as he tumbled to the icy ground. The snowplow, despite being made of reinforced steel and designed to withstand the harshness of the winter environment, caved inward from the force of Nicholas's impact. Its designers had neglected to reinforce it against a possible strike from Santa Claus himself, and it was nearly wrenched in two as Father Christmas crumpled the chassis with his own body. Nicholas's vision swam in excruciating pain as he hissed and struggled to breathe without making his pain worse. One of his arms might have been broken, but pain was coming in from every part of his body right now, and it was difficult to discern to what extent his body had been damaged. Nicholas had managed to land propped up on his back against the snowplow that had been rendered into scrap metal behind him. And despite the sound of the wind and the searing agony, everything seemed to fade into the background as he heard the sound of chains clinking and clattering. Lifting his head slowly and looking upward, Nicholas watched with trepidation as the silhouette of Krampus lumbered slowly out of the snowfall. The hooked end of the chain whistled menacingly as it was swung in a lazy vertical circle, its tip periodically scraping the snow off the ground as it whizzed past. Nicholas struggled to his feet as Krampus nonchalantly drew closer, the two of them both knowing that the outcome had been all but decided. Without his weapon, Nicholas had no choice but to continue the fight with his bare fists. Up against Krampus's physical might, it would no doubt prove minimally effective. Nicholas's breath came in short rasps as he struggled with the pain in his chest, and he used as much magic as he could muster to heal his body. Slowly, his ribs began to realign themselves, and his right arm, which he finally found to be fractured, began the accelerated process of healing, its pain growing as a result of the quickened pace. By Nicholas's estimate, it would take his body only a minute or so to heal completely, but he doubted Krampus would let him have that. And even if the demon waited until his body was restored, Nicholas would still be exhausted, as such use of his magic was extremely taxing. Even so, Nicholas raised his fists in a combative stance, ready to muster what little defense he could when Krampus chose to strike again. The monster rumbled again with a slow laughter at his effort, and now that Nicholas could see his face entirely, hearing the sound made for an even more odious experience. The hooked chain began to spin faster as Krampus wound up for another blow, and with dismay, Nicholas realized that there was nothing he could do against it. He couldn't dodge, he couldn't block, he couldn't even find cover, for there was no time to duck behind the remnants of the large snow plow behind him. Krampus seemed to know that as well, and the whistling grew in pitch and loudness as the chain swung faster and faster, its speed making its appearance closer to that of the blades of a propeller with the rate of its spin. Over Krampus's shoulder, a faint red light suddenly appeared against the black wall of snow and ice, and Nicholas frowned at its sudden and anomalous appearance despite the fatal danger in front of him. The light suddenly grew brighter, and in the next moment, Rudolph soared back into view, spinning end over end rapidly and in a straight line towards Krampus. Nicholas's eyes widened at the sight, the axe's rate of spin fast enough that the glowing red axe head took on the appearance of a glowing red disc. With the momentum of a truck, the axe crashed into Krampus's exposed flank, and the monster stumbled forward as the weight of the throw threw him off balance. He howled in indignation and pain as Rudolph dug deep into his back. And then, following the axe, the Doomslayer appeared, grabbing hold of the long haft and pulling with his Herculean strength. Krampus roared as the axe kept its hold deep in his back, and with a great heave, the Slayer swung Krampus off his hooves and threw him down the street and away from Nicholas, wrenching Rudolph from the monster's back in a bloody exit as he did so. The demon landed hard, and though he possessed the ability to heal with his magic like Nicholas, it would take at least a few minutes to fully heal from a wound as severe as the one the Slayer had just imparted upon him. It was now Krampus's turn to take his time to rise, and the Doomslayer made good use of the time by approaching Nicholas, where he stood slightly hunched over, holding Rudolph in an easy grip. "It seems my debt to you only grows as this night continues," Nicholas croaked as he concentrated on healing his remaining wounds. The Doomslayer said nothing, only depositing Rudolph in Nicholas's hands before turning to face Krampus once more, readying a formidable-looking double-barreled shotgun as he did so. "No," Nicholas said, standing up straight now that his wounds were almost fully healed. "Krampus is my fight. I will not and cannot ask you to fight my battles for me, no matter your strength." There was a meaning behind Nicholas's words that went unspoken, but as the Doomslayer turned back to look at him, Nicholas knew somehow that he understood. Krampus and Nicholas, despite being exact opposites in their ideals and what they stood for, were both given their strength by the same kind of magic. It was the magic that flowed from all living creatures and was given shape and purpose by the souls and emotions that they experienced. Nicholas represented the culmination of the kindness and wonder that humans shared amongst themselves in their greatest moments, and Krampus represented their bitterness and animosity, what humans were in their darkest of days. Tonight, the two of them had directly opposed each other for the first time, and the resulting buildup of both of their magics had created a volatile bubble that threatened to pop at any outside interference. It was a culmination that Nicholas had not seen at first, but as their battle had continued, it had grown to incredible proportions, saturating the very air around them and feeding the ferocious storm that howled above. Should one of them slay the other, the magical buildup would default to the victor, allowing them to harness the power of their defeated foe as well as their own and turn it to their own whim. If Nicholas were victorious, he could use the magic to right the wrongs Krampus had created on this night and help foster the return of the Christmas spirit into the hearts of all. If Krampus was victorious, Nicholas refused to think about what might occur. Should one of them fall to an outside entity from beyond this world, however, then all of their magic would explode, as the victor would be a being that was not inherently part of the magical ecosystem that existed in this world, and therefore incompatible with the magic that existed within it. Unable to be harnessed by anyone, the magic would break free in an uncontrollable torrent that would wreak havoc worldwide. The magic would overflow into living beings that were not equipped to handle such a high amount, and the results would be catastrophic. Horrible mutations, natural disasters, diseases of extreme potency, all life would undergo an extreme shift in reality. Though the Doomslayer was without a doubt capable of killing Krampus, his doing so would do more harm than good. And though the Slayer was not of this world, and therefore not capable of producing or harnessing the magic that existed, Nicholas knew that the Slayer could still sense it somehow. Both he and Vega seemed to possess a keen sort of insight into the tangible and intangible, and though he may not have known the details, the Slayer could read Nicholas well enough that there was more at stake than simply placing himself in harm's way. The Slayer lowered his shotgun, the motion done with a slight degree of stiffness due to the fact that the being he intended to use it on was still alive. A glance over Nicholas's form seemed to create another conclusion in the Slayer's mind, and he then produced a glass soda bottle filled with a bright green liquid. The label, which was of a similar green to the soda itself, read, "Speed Cola." "If you are unable to utilize the Slayer's direct assistance," Vega's voice began, "then please accept what assistance we can provide, as I am not confident that you will be successful without it." Those words coming from anyone else would have carried the morbidity of Nicholas's obvious disadvantage against Krampus. But from Vega, they only portrayed a genuine desire to assist, and Nicholas almost found them comforting as he accepted the bottle. His magic whispered to him as he opened the bottle with a soft popping noise, speaking again of the ancient and exceedingly powerful nature of the Doomslayer. There were even quieter whispers among them this time, however, and though he could only barely hear them, he could have sworn he heard the word "Father" sprinkled among their phrases. It was stranger still that the whispers spoke with a different and more melancholy tone, as if they were not speaking of the Slayer. The whispers quieted as the Hellhound arrived on the scene, trotting around the wreckage of the snowplow instead of teleporting directly to the two of them. The flaming canine fixed its glowing eyes on Krampus's slowly rising form, then bared its teeth and growled in anticipation. The Slayer looked down at the creature, then looked back to Nicholas pointedly, and though not a word was spoken, Nicholas knew that the Slayer was prompting him to allow the Hellhound to fight at his side. Nicholas's first reaction was to refuse, as the Hound was also not of this world, and would therefore cause a similar magical calamity were it to be the one to kill Krampus. Then his tactical mind spoke next, reminding him that the Hellhound was intelligent, meaning that it could also understand why Nicholas would need to be the one to slay Krampus. He was also reminded of the extreme agility the creature possessed, and how it was formidable enough to hold its own in combat without needing to be looked after. This was even before one took into account its teleportation abilities. The Hellhound watched intently as the Doomslayer gestured to Nicholas, then shook its fur in understanding, a few embers shaking loose and landing like fiery snowflakes on the icy street. Maneuvering to stand next to Nicholas, the Hound looked up at him expectantly, conveying the message that it would follow his lead. Nicholas looked between the two of them for a moment, then back to Krampus, who had finally risen back to his full height once again. Their gazes locked, and for the first time, Nicholas didn't feel the same frightening dread he had felt before when gazing upon the face of his enemy. Instead, anticipation took its place, and Nicholas set his jaw before downing the contents of the green soda bottle. The cola had an oddly spiced flavor, but Nicholas paid it no mind as he put the bottle aside and stepped forward, the Hellhound mirroring his movements. Krampus started forward as well, his demonic eyes taking note of the fact that the Hellhound was at Nicholas's side while the Slayer stayed behind. The vile eyes narrowed and lingered at the sight of the armored human, and Nicholas had no doubt that Krampus's magic was whispering to him as well, speaking of the Slayer and the power he wielded just as it had to Nicholas. Something else flashed behind the demon's eyes as well, but it was gone before Nicholas could look further. Krampus returned his focus to Nicholas soon enough, and with a low growl, the chain in his gnarled claws began to swing once again, and this time Nicholas noticed something. Though the chain was once again swinging at extreme speed thanks to Krampus's strength, it felt slower than before for some reason. Nicholas noticed that his eyes were still able to track the chain's movement as it whirled through the air, and after a moment, he realized that it wasn't just the chain that had appeared to be slower. The very snowfall around them seemed to be less chaotic and easier to see through, and Nicholas suddenly found himself much more capable of making out details and subtle changes in the world as they occurred in real time. Nicholas then remembered the green soda he had consumed moments ago, and he realized that it was not the world around him that had changed. Whatever it was that he drank had sharpened his senses, allowing him to easily focus on the finer details of the world and process them at greater speed within his mind. His focus, his coordination, his reflexes, all were heightened beyond their maximum. And with his newfound perception, Nicholas felt his anticipation give way to steadfast confidence. The Hellhound echoed his sentiment, the fire on its back growing brighter and hotter as they drew closer to their foe. There was the slightest twitch in Krampus's wrist, then the heavy iron hook whipped forward, the sharpened point greedy for purchase somewhere in Nicholas's flesh. It was fast, so fast that Nicholas would have only been able to block the strike before. But now he had known the blow was coming before the hook had even started its trajectory, and Nicholas was in motion long before the hook cut through the air he'd been standing in mere moments before. Bringing Rudolph to bear, Nicholas summoned his will and filled the axe head with it, red running brightly through the ruined surface. The cola had the additional effect of increasing his confidence with the weapon, and so much stronger was their bond that Nicholas could hear the wisps of intelligent thought as words in his mind as the red energy culminated at last. Strike! No movement was wasted. It was as though his will was one with that of his weapon, and together they cleaved through the long stretch of chain in the monster's fingers, cutting directly through the links and causing the hooked end to come free. The hook, as well as nearly 2 meters of the vile chain, flew through the air and out of sight, the point of their severance glowing white-hot from the heat where Rudolph had cleaved through. Nicholas followed through with the swing and spun with the momentum, gaining speed for a follow-up strike on the other end of the chain. Krampus, still possessing greater speed than he, reached out with his claws bared to stop him, but the Hellhound warped forward and clamped its jaws down hard, disrupting the attack and throwing Krampus off balance. The demon's indignant cry was cut off as Nicholas severed the other end of the chain weapon as well, the heavy bell thudding to the ground with a dull clang. Krampus had little time to mourn the loss of his weapon, as Nicholas and the Hound pressed the attack with a coordination that could only be seen between two experienced warriors. Nicholas, with his newfound reflexes and attention to detail, made precision strikes with Rudolph that grew more potent with every swing. Attacks were all deliberately aimed at weak points, and blocks and deflections were calculated with such timing that they almost seemed to happen by accident. Many times, Nicholas found the foresight to swing for an attack while perfectly timing the position of Rudolph so as to interrupt Krampus's own attacks mid-swing. It was a clarity that Nicholas had never experienced in battle before, and every motion he made felt natural, expected even, like a sunrise or the falling of leaves in autumn. Despite fighting for the very existence of Christmas itself, Nicholas felt unexpectedly peaceful for the first time that night. All this was accentuated by the presence of the Hellhound, who moved in tandem to balance or strengthen Nicholas's assault as the situation changed. The canine seemed wholly aware of the power and speed that Krampus possessed, and the four-legged creature utilized its abilities accordingly, careful not to overextend its own attacks lest it be struck by hoof or claw. And yet, its impact on the fight was immense, as it provided Nicholas with plenty of openings to rend his foe. And Nicholas capitalized on every single one. Hardly minutes had passed before Krampus became desperate. Nicholas had just removed one of the demon's horns from its head with a clean swing of his axe when Krampus bellowed and forced the two of them back with a forceful push of his own vile magic. Nicholas crossed his arms in protection and was hardly buffeted at all by the attack, though he knew that the attack had the primary purpose of pushing him away versus wounding him. Skidding backward a few meters, Nicholas met Krampus's gaze once more to see that the demon was drawing upon its last reserves, exhausting whatever stamina remained in favor of utilizing some of its most powerful magical attacks. Contrary to the warm red of Nicholas's own magic, Krampus's magic wreathed through his claws in a dark, deep blue that was tinted with black. The air grew colder, still as Krampus's inner power manifested itself physically, but Nicholas did not shiver. A look over Krampus's wounded and heaving form told him that this battle was nearing its end. Yes, Krampus had just drastically increased in lethality, but in doing so, the monster was burning through the last of his magical power. It showed just how much the demon's back was against the wall, and it had favored one final powerful push instead of pacing himself to reserve his stamina. Standing to meet the challenge, Nicholas held out a halting arm to the Hellhound, who seemed annoyed for the briefest of moments, then finally relented with a soft grunt, stepping back and disengaging from the encounter. From here on out, this fight was Nicholas's and Nicholas's alone. Summoning his will, Nicholas pulled deeply from his magic, channeling it not just through Rudolph, but through his entire body as well. His form illuminated brightly with a strong red glow, and Nicholas felt the power surge through his muscles and skin, granting additional power everywhere it reached. Using his magic in this way was extremely taxing, but Nicholas would need it to face Krampus now, as the beast had done the same with his own magic. As of this moment, the chips were down. It was time to end this. Nicholas charged, his now enhanced speed complementing the benefits he had received from the cola. And though Krampus's speed still outmatched his own, it gave no advantage against Nicholas's skill. Sparks crackled each time the two clashed, the air constantly charged by the similar, yet conflicting energies the two of them possessed. Rudolph's powerful hum had risen to that of a hiss as it seared with power, and Nicholas shared in its stoic excitement as he traded blows with Krampus once more. Above them, the storm reached its climax as well, lightning and thunder dominating the blizzard as the heavens split apart above them all. Nicholas's brow furrowed as he parried and struck, his calculating eyes searching for the opening he needed to end this once and for all. Flurries of snow and ice encircled the two as they continued to fight, the very earth itself invested in the outcome of their conflict. There, Nicholas heard Rudolph in his mind, and in a split second he saw it. Krampus was almost on fumes now, and the monster was growing more bold in his movements, attempting to land a decisive hit on Nicholas before his power was exhausted completely. He was on the verge of overextending himself. In the next moment, he did. Krampus roared and swung his claw in a powerful but extremely sluggish and telegraphed blow. With Nicholas's newfound reflexes, the monster may as well have told him that the attack was coming. Nicholas ducked with time to spare as Krampus's claw sailed harmlessly over his head, and spinning the axe, Nicholas struck the back of Krampus's swinging arm with the flat of the blade, imparting additional momentum to the swing and causing Krampus to stumble. The axe never stopped moving, and as Krampus struggled to regain his balance, Nicholas buried Rudolph deep into the back of the demon's exposed knee, eliciting a deep roar from Krampus and causing the limb to crumple. There was no hesitation as Nicholas wrenched the axe free and moved to the other side, sweeping wide to build up his speed before swinging for the back of Krampus's other knee. This time with such force that the limb was sliced through completely, severing Krampus's leg at the base of the knee and causing his lumbering form to topple completely. Nicholas rushed back to Krampus's front, the two of them almost eye level now that the beast had fallen onto his knees, or rather, what was left of him. The monster roared and swung at him again despite its wounds, but the movement was slow and weak, and Nicholas severed the arm that reached for him, locking eyes with Krampus for the briefest of moments. Hatred and anger was all that glowed behind the sockets, and the two entities regarded each other with one last glance before Nicholas swung Rudolph high, separating Krampus's head from his shoulders. As if turned off by a switch, the wind suddenly ceased, snowfall suddenly slowing to the pace of dripping molasses as the lighting and the thunder disappeared as well. All was eerily still. Not a creature dared to stir, not even a mouse. And then, as if delayed by surprise, the buildup of magic that had gathered in this town all fell inward, recognizing Nicholas as the victor and falling under his command. Nicholas drew in a sharp breath at the overwhelming surge he felt through his being as he commanded the might of Krampus's magic in tandem with his own. The cold prickle of Krampus's power was purified as Nicholas shaped it to his will, and once he had a chance to adjust, Nicholas raised Rudolph high into the air, a sharp red beam of light bursting from the axe and straight upward into the night sky. The harsh blizzard immediately abated, the might of Nicholas's newfound power banishing the storm entirely, replacing the thunder and lightning with a gentle snowfall all throughout the town. Lowering his axe at last, Nicholas turned to the sounds of footsteps approaching through the snow. His eyes fell upon the Doomslayer and the Hellhound as they approached, both leaving behind a sizable pile of corpses behind them. It seemed that Krampus had left some of his force as a reserve contingency to ambush Nicholas should he appear to gain the upper hand, and they had both encountered the Slayer and the Hound in their mission to aid their master. The results spoke for themselves. Nicholas gave a nod to them both as they approached, then turned to see a large contingent of his own army arriving as well, Stefan at the head of the formation. "Sir," his commander called, his eyes wide as he took in Nicholas's ambient glow and Krampus's headless form laying nearby. "Wah, explanations will have to wait, Commander," Nicholas said, striding forward. "For Christmas is almost upon us, and there is much left to do." Nicholas stood stoically on a hill, the same one he had stood atop mere hours ago. Though his eyes were once again surveying the town below, they were doing so with pride and appreciation for his forces, as their efforts had almost erased any sign that Krampus had been there that night. After gathering the army of the North Pole, Nicholas had dispatched many back to their rescue efforts, and others still to the process of gathering the dead and clearing the signs of carnage from the streets. In this manner, Nicholas also lent his newfound abilities, using the abundance of magic he possessed to remove the corpses and carrion from the town. He also utilized the magic to repair the damage that had been done to the infrastructure as well, his power potent enough to repair houses and vehicles in the blink of an eye. All was done with a somber tone, however, as their victory on this night had not come without great sacrifice. Numerous elves had fallen to the hordes of Krampus, and their losses here were bolstered further by many Yeti, polar bears, and reindeer, and Nicholas felt guilt grip his conscience as he assisted in the proper removal and care of their fallen comrades. To add even more sorrow, Nicholas soon discovered that their losses extended beyond that of their own forces as well, as it quickly became known that a great number of residents of the town had been taken by Krampus before Nicholas's arrival. Just as he had before, the holiday demon had whisked away as many denizens of the town as he could, and just as before, Nicholas had no way of knowing where they had gone. There was no trace, no signs, no. Nicholas stopped his train of thought as his magic began to whisper to him again. It spoke of a place where Krampus's magic still lingered, a hidden location that the monster retreated to when the holiday season ended. Alike and yet still opposite to Nicholas, Krampus had his own workshop where he crafted his cruel and vile imitations of Nicholas's toys and gifts. And with a start, Nicholas realized that those that had gone missing might be found there. And with not a second to waste, Nicholas left the town in Stefan's capable hands and took to the skies, pausing only to bring the Doom Slayer and Vega with him. The speed of Nicholas's flying sleigh was unmatched by any vessel crafted by humanity, and within no time at all, they had arrived at the location his magic had spoken of, the Antarctic. The magic led them to a cave deeply nested in the ice-covered mountains, and it was there that Nicholas finally laid eyes on Krampus's nightmare workshop. Huge machines churned out black smoke and gave form to the hellacious nightmares that Krampus used in his plight. And though the workshop was nearly empty, Nicholas and the Doom Slayer encountered a skeleton guard of dark elves and golems, which were dealt with swiftly. It was when they finally made their way to the rear of the cave that Nicholas found what it was he'd been looking for, though unfortunately, he was unprepared for the horror that he discovered. The first thing that both he and the Slayer encountered was a dark room filled with snow globes, each one a window into the lives and souls of families found throughout the world. Krampus, in his twisted mind, had crafted each snow globe as a means to find and sow discord and sorrow into the hearts of humanity. And looking at each globe gave Nicholas a pang in his chest as he recognized each and every family that had been placed under Krampus's watchful eye. As horrid as the discovery was, it paled in comparison to what they discovered next. The Doom Slayer uncovered it through a hidden door in the back of the room full of snow globes, and there, behind the rock and stone, Nicholas uncovered the truth behind the disappearances. There, hung on the walls, and spread across the cavern they found were texts and scrolls thousands of years older than Nicholas himself, written in a dialogue that predated this planet. The strange documents held both descriptions and depictions of an ancient technique, one that Nicholas saw to be cruel and spiteful based on the pictures he saw. Images of humans being tortured and enslaved by demonic creatures were spread all across the tablets. And after careful examination, Nicholas realized with horror what became of those humans that Krampus stole. Nicholas could not understand the details, but nor did he want to, for the process laid out in these ancient documents was despicable beyond measure. From what Nicholas understood, the procedure facilitated the removal of the human soul from the body by way of hellacious torture. The body, devoid of its aura, became subject to the molding of its form, and with a grim realization, Nicholas remembered that a few of the machines that churned within this nightmare workshop matched the ones in the depiction. The aura, devoid of its body, was also capable of becoming corrupted, and with no small amount of torture and conditioning, could be repurposed to the will of its avulser and implemented into another form, organic or inorganic. The dark elves, the golems, all of those abominations that had walked the battlefield tonight. Nicholas felt hollow as everything was suddenly made clear. Krampus's entire workshop, every machine and worker, all existed for the purpose of increasing his hordes of the damned. For millennia, the holiday demon had captured humans for their souls and bodies, corrupting the latter into the forms of his dark elves and twisting the former into the life forces that powered his evil toys and automatons. And these texts, all older than perhaps even Krampus, were the blueprints that made it so. Nicholas spared a glance to the Doomed Slayer and was taken aback when he saw angered recognition in the armored man's movements. The human clenched his hands in rage at the texts he saw before him, and Nicholas's eyes unthinkingly flitted between the documents and the mark etched on the Slayer's helm. That symbol was a direct match to a few others that could be found on the scrolls. These texts, do you recognize them? Nicholas asked gravely. I cannot speak for the Doomed Slayer, Vega replied. However, many of these documents are similar in format and lexicon to that of relics recovered from the hell of our home dimension. That would mean, Nicholas said almost in a whisper, that Krampus was... I do not possess enough evidence to make a conclusive statement on the origins of Krampus, Vega continued. But the presence of these documents does strongly suggest that he was a demon from our hell. There exist many flaws to this theory, however. How do you mean? While Krampus did indeed possess similar traits to the demons we are familiar with, Vega began, there were still many irregularities to his form, though this does not mean that he did not originate from our hell, as there are still many subspecies of demon yet to be discovered. Nicholas's brow furrowed as the AI continued. The largest flaw in the theory is that the circumstances do not match the typical behavior of the demons from our dimension's hell. Typical hell invasions are large in scale and are not done clandestinely by a single demon. This inconsistency also does not disprove the theory, however, as the demon may have somehow arrived here by accident. And it does little to help us understand how it obtained documents with the seal of the Night Sentinels. The name Night Sentinels meant nothing to Nicholas, but before he could inquire further, the Doom Slayer knelt down and picked up one smaller scroll that had been discarded and cast into the corner of the room, obviously found to be worthless by Krampus when it had been in his possession. Moving closer to inspect the scroll as well, Nicholas squinted in the dim candlelight to see that it was also a sort of blueprint like the others, though this one was for something far smaller in scale, and though Nicholas still could not read the text associated with the depictions, he had spent the equivalent of countless human lifetimes learning and perfecting his trade as Santa Claus, and he was smart enough to know the design of a weapon when he saw one. A glance at how the Slayer regarded this smaller scroll was enough for Nicholas to make up his mind, and though it was difficult to find something to smile about in this wretched place, Nicholas felt the beginnings of one pull at his lips at the idea that began to form in his mind. Come with me, Slayer. Let's leave this place in flames and be off. Christmas is almost upon us, and there is still much left to be done. It was short and eager work for the Doom Slayer and Nicholas to destroy Krampus's odious workshop, and in the process, they had discovered with great relief that the most recent batch of humans that Krampus had captured were still alive, and using the full extent of Nicholas's magic, they were whisked away from that awful place and returned to their homes. That night, Nicholas cast a deep and powerful sleep over all the town's residents, and with that deep slumber, Nicholas eased their tortured memories from their minds, erasing all thoughts of Krampus and what had almost become of them had the demon been successful on that fateful Christmas Eve. His work had finished just minutes short of midnight, and though exhaustion was felt by all members of his army, there was no time to rest, as it was once again time for Nicholas to deliver his gifts across the globe. His sleigh was loaded in record time with the assistance of the Yeti and the Slayer, and shortly, Nicholas was airborne. The grand feeling of once again delivering gifts to the world warmed his heart like no other. The sense of familiarity pushed the thoughts of the night's battle from Nicholas's mind, and it wasn't until it was time to deliver his gifts to the town where the battle had occurred that they returned. Unconsciously, Nicholas had left this specific neighborhood for last, and the only gifts that remained in his sleigh were for the residents below as he flew over the site. Looking down, Nicholas was pleased to see that not a trace remained of their battle, and he took comfort in the fact that the residents of the town would not have to live with the grim memory for the rest of their lives. Despite the ill will and darkness within their hearts that had fostered Krampus's arrival in the first place, they still did not deserve the horrid fate that Krampus had planned for them. It was with this in mind that Nicholas took extra care to move silently throughout each house, taking extra care to ensure that he did not disturb the deep slumber he had induced in each and every one of them. Undisturbed, they would all remain sound asleep until the sun rose on Christmas Day. Thankfully, Nicholas was certain that the greatest of disturbances that could be found on this night had been soundly defeated. And with a sense of satisfaction, Nicholas shimmied easily down the final chimney, the last of the gifts safely secured in his sack. With hardly a sound, Nicholas's boots landed on the brickwork that constituted the bottom of the hearth, and though the overhand was low, Nicholas effortlessly ducked his head and stepped into the living room of the last house on the block. Nicholas was stunned for a moment, as this was the exact same room where he'd first come face to face with Krampus mere hours ago. The room had been restored to the polished feeling it had once held before Krampus's arrival. Soft and colorful stockings were hung from the mantelpiece, complemented by a beautifully decorated wreath acting as the centerpiece of the chimney decor, though the large ornament was by no means the centerpiece of the entire room. That honor was reserved for the tree, bright and prominent among all other Christmas decorations in the room. Nicholas admired the tree for a moment, relishing in taking a moment alone too. Nicholas froze. He wasn't alone. Someone was in the room with him. Someone was looking at him. Slowly, Nicholas turned, and all the anticipation he had felt up until that moment dissipated completely when he saw none other than Omi's own kind eyes on his own from where she stood in front of the couch by the fire. For a brief second, Nicholas wondered how his magic had overlooked her and not sent her into a deep sleep like the rest of her family upstairs. But he then remembered. His magic had been used to erase the memories of Krampus only on this night, and Krampus, as Nicholas knew all too well, had visited Omi once before. Nicholas felt a weight on his shoulders like he never had before, a weight that dragged his heart to the depths of cold and ice as he bore witness to the destruction before him. It had been a wonderful Christmas, just like any other, and he had been on his usual route delivering gifts. He had felt happy, excited even, as he neared the next village. But as he drew closer, Nicholas felt a chill like an icicle drive into his chest as he felt the magic in the air. Magic that was never a good sign. Krampus. Nicholas's worst fears were confirmed as he flew above the town. The already war-torn village reduced to even further until very few structures remained intact. The air tasted of a blizzard that was abating at last, and Nicholas knew that the blizzard had not come by natural means. Krampus had been here, and recently, but that should have been impossible. Nicholas had dispatched 2 elfish informants to this village when it was first founded nearly 200 years ago. Carl and Ilsa, 2 well-trained and motivated operatives, should have immediately sounded the alarm upon learning that the demon had come. And yet, the North Pole had heard nothing but reports of good tidings from the village. The messages telling of how the spirit of Christmas was still alive and well within the community. Such reports did not match the sight that greeted Nicholas below, and reinforcements were called for at once. Stefan and a small company of elves were on the scene within minutes, and together, Nicholas worked with them to sweep through the town, visiting the ruined buildings to search for any survivors and the fate of the elves stationed here. The elves were found rather quickly, though that had been by design. As it were, Krampus had wanted Santa and his elves to find their missing helpers, and Nicholas was stricken with grief and anger when they discovered their bodies. Dressed in fake white beards and bright red stocking caps as a mockery to Nicholas, both Carl and Ilsa were discovered within the town square, their bodies swinging from cages that were hoisted from the destroyed church with barbed chains. A few of the elfish troops became physically ill at the sight, and Nicholas did not blame them. Such desecration was beneath that of even the most detestable of humans, but for Krampus, it was all just some sick game. The demon had known that Nicholas would arrive in this village eventually, and he had left behind as much trauma as he could to remind Nicholas and his elves just how dangerous he could be. His humor was also cruel and wicked, and he could not resist toying with his victims as well as his enemies. Nicholas cleaned up the bodies using his magic, taking extra care to treat them with reverence. They continued their search for survivors, but their spirit had diminished greatly, the reality of the situation settling heavily upon all of them. Nicholas walked in a haze, his mind awash with guilt as he struggled to consider what he could have done differently. How could he have let this village grow so cold? How could he have better trained his informants so that they wouldn't be discovered by Krampus? What could prevent such a dark fate from befalling the other villages as well? Nicholas was pulled from his thoughts as he heard a muffled crying from the house he was walking past, and away to the source he flew like a flash. There, curled up with tears streaming down her cheeks, sat a little girl within the remnants of a once joyful Christmas household. In front of the tarnished chimney, the girl sat, her eyes periodically looking up to the destroyed flue in fear that something would come through at any moment. She was just over 7 years old, and Nicholas knew her name, the names of her parents, and the names of her grandparents as well. He knew almost everything about the little girl, though on this night, it was a burden more than a blessing. A piece of lingering magic spoke to Nicholas as he watched her for a moment, speaking of the ill will that had been sown into the hearts of all on that Christmas season, the girl's own young heart included. Whether fostered by Krampus's own meddling or without, Nicholas knew that in the end, it was humanity that was always the best defense against Krampus. In darkened times, hope and cheer was something that could always be given to others, and it only took a spark, one small flame against the gloom, to fan the embers of goodwill that always resided within the world. Nicholas sensed that spark within this young girl, and though it had been snuffed out by those around her this Christmas season, Nicholas still felt his heart go out to her, as it was hearts like hers that had the greatest capacity to spread cheer and joy. Nicholas spoke softly to the young girl, careful not to startle her as she turned her tear-stained features toward him. Noting her to be dressed only in a nightgown, Nicholas shouldered off his heavy red coat and offered it to her. At first, the girl was hesitant and distrustful of Nicholas, as she certainly had every right to be, but the prospect of warmth against the cold that gripped her body and soul enticed her forward. And through his magic, Nicholas shrank the coat down in size so that it fit her perfectly. The girl was obviously warmed by the magical garment, but she was still skeptical of Nicholas, and as he slowly worked to ease her fears and make her feel safe, Nicholas took note of the small bauble that she held tightly in her hands. He recognized it immediately. It was a small, iron bell, a calling card that Nicholas had seen many times before when Christmas was forsaken and belief was forgotten. Krampus left them behind as a reminder, much like he had done with the elves outside, that he was still there and waiting, for Krampus drank deeply off of the fear of those that believed in him. Nicholas made no move to separate the young girl from the bell, though his brow furrowed for the briefest of moments as he read Krampus's name etched along the side. The girl, at last getting over her initial shock at seeing Nicholas, began to cry once more, the loss of her mother and father fresh on her mind and eliciting trauma that no child should ever have had to bear. Nicholas's heart went out to her, and he soothed her as best as he knew how with his words, while simultaneously lulling the young girl into a deep sleep with his magic. This tortured house was no place for her to remain, and soon enough, the young girl cried herself out, her eyelids drooping heavily as Nicholas's magic took effect. With gentle urging, Nicholas took the girl's small hand in his own and led her outside, carefully exiting through the rear entrance of the home so that she could not see the devastation that extended beyond her own front door. He helped her climb carefully into his sleigh, and it was not long before she sat down that she had curled up and fell into a deep slumber, Nicholas's coat protecting her from the cold wind that still lingered in this dark place. Nicholas left her side only for the briefest moments to give lasting orders to Stefan and the rest, then took to the skies, making his way to the nearby village where relatives of the young girl lived. He would leave her with them, and though she would likely dismiss the image of Nicholas as a dream in the upcoming days, the memory of Krampus would always be seared in her mind. The small bell still clutched in her fingers, a constant reminder of his wrath. Krampus himself had even gone so far as to use his own magic on her to ensure that this night would never be forgotten, leaving Nicholas helpless to help alleviate her pain. The best he could hope for was that the girl would turn her pain into strength, and would use that spark he knew she possessed to stir the hearts of others in the future. Perhaps, with the help of her and those like her, Nicholas could prevent the tragedy of this Christmas from ever repeating itself. And now, standing before Omi all of those years later, Nicholas knew that Omi had seen far too much to forget what Krampus had been, but she also remembered Nicholas now too, and with her hands folded reverently in front of her, Omi spoke. "I always thought that I had dreamed you up, Wynaxman," Omi said, speaking entirely in her native language, "that you were nothing more than a trick of my mind to explain how I was delivered from my village that night. Perhaps it is better that you think of me as an apparition now as well," Nicholas said with a smile. "I'm afraid the years have not been kind to my appearance." In truth, Nicholas's appearance had changed very little for a few thousand years now, and the joke earned a genuine smile from Omi. "You are just how I remembered you, though it was the warmth I remember above all else." Omi gestured to Nicholas's coat, which she still wore around her shoulders from when Nicholas had given it to her a few hours before. It was the same coat that had given her warmth the night Krampus had taken her village all those years ago. She made to return the coat to him now, but Nicholas stopped her with a gentle raise of his hand. "A gift," he said simply. "I left nothing to remember me by when you were young. So let me leave you something now." Omi smiled gratefully, but then her gaze turned somber as she fished a small object from her pocket. Nicholas knew what it was before she revealed it, and it was no surprise to him as he laid eyes once again on the small bell that Omi had held onto for all these years. Yet now, the bell had changed. A long crack split the metal right over where Krampus's name was etched into the darkened iron, perhaps generated the moment the beast fell. Omi looked from the bell to him, her eyes searching for an answer, and after a moment, Nicholas nodded. "Krampus is gone," he said. "For the time being, he is defeated." Omi understood more than anyone else what Nicholas meant. She did not understand the nature of the magic of this world, but she did understand humanity. Krampus, while indeed dead on this night at the hands of Nicholas, was not the ultimate source of suffering any more than Nicholas was the ultimate source of joy and holiday cheer. The two of them were simply avatars, vessels that reflected what lay beneath the skin of humanity. All Nicholas had done was simply destroy the personification of what still remained. And while humanity could indeed breathe easy for a while now that Krampus was gone, Nicholas knew that eventually a replacement would make themselves known. It was not likely to be a demon, as it had been before, but likely a human like Nicholas had once been, empowered by the dark and twisted nature of humanity and rising up to oppose Nicholas like its predecessor had done before. No, to truly be rid of Krampus, people like Omi were needed, people who understood the meaning of giving and self-sacrifice, and just how much more potent those things were than selfishness and greed. They were the true keepers of the spirit of Christmas, and though Nicholas would always be there to foster their joy in what ways he knew how, it was ultimately up to them to keep the magic flowing. Omi knew this, as she had twice now seen firsthand what became of those that succumbed to the darkness. Without them, humanity was lost, doomed to wallow in a cycle of self-destruction and pain. But with them, they flourished, amplifying their strengths and overcoming their weaknesses in ways that astounded Nicholas to this day. "My grandson still believes in you," Omi said, pulling out another object from her pocket. This time, it was a small envelope, and she handed it to Nicholas carefully, obviously believing the contents to be of great importance. Nicholas smiled again, as he already knew what was within, and he broke the seal and opened the envelope, revealing a collection of paper scraps within. The paper scraps were covered with handwritten words, and Nicholas summoned his will and used his magic to coax the paper scraps from the envelope. The fluttering pieces billowed about, as though they were leaves floating on the breeze, and as the fire crackled within the hearth, Nicholas willed the scraps back together, this time reassembling into the one whole sheet they had once been. It was a letter, but it was not just any letter. No, this letter was addressed to Nicholas himself from a young boy that he knew quite well. Max was his name, and though he was subject to mischief and careless curiosity like so many other children his age, Nicholas had always found him to be pure of heart, and that thought was only proven correct as Nicholas read the letter in its entirety. The letter, like so many others addressed to Nicholas during this time of year, spoke of hardship. But Max's was different, as it spoke of not only his own, but that of his family's, and it went on to beseech Nicholas for his help for not just Max, but for his family and relatives as well. He, just like Omi, possessed the spark that the world so desperately needed. "Well now, this is quite the wish list," Nicholas said. Omi gave a somber nod, knowing that all that Max had wished for was for his family to be happy again. "It seems, however, that young Max has asked me to give that which he has more than enough capacity to give for himself." Omi's smile returned as Nicholas spoke, as she understood wholeheartedly in a way that Nicholas knew that she would. These things that Max desired, for his parents to love each other once again, for him and his sister to get along better, for help with his aunt and uncle and cousins, all of these wishes were things that were not Nicholas's to give. It was up to Max and his growing spark of goodwill and belief to foster the peace and love he wished to see in others. But that didn't mean that Nicholas could lend a helping hand. With a knowing smile, Nicholas turned without a word and went straight to his work, removing the last of his present from his sack and tucking them safely under the tree to be opened on Christmas morning by Omi's family. Once they all rested comfortably under the lighted branches, Nicholas turned back to Omi, and with a flick of his wrist, produced a paper and quill of his own, penning down a letter addressed to Max and Max alone. Nicholas spoke of the spirit of Christmas, and that the true gifts of the season did not come from Nicholas, but rather from those that you cared for. And more often than not, true giving did not come in the form of something you could wrap up in a package. Though the boy was still young and learning the ways of the world, Nicholas did not doubt that he would understand. With his letter complete, Nicholas produced a wax seal and stamped the letter right next to his signature, and once it was enveloped and sealed, carefully gave it to Omi. Let's hope they still teach cursive in schools. Nicholas joked with a wink as Omi gratefully accepted the letter. Otherwise, it might be New Year's before he reads all the way through it. Omi's laugh was genuine, and before Nicholas could turn to leave, she embraced him and squeezed him tight with a strength that defied her years. Nicholas was gentle in returning her hug, and he smiled as the wide-eyed little girl from all those years ago resurfaced, her belief in Christmas and miracles shining brightly from the depths of her soul. He held her for a long moment, then slowly released her, wishing her one last Merry Christmas before shimming back up the chimney and starting for home. To the east, the sky was just beginning to illuminate with the light of Christmas morning, and though his route had been completed, Nicholas still had one more gift to give before he could rest. Upon his return to the North Pole, Nicholas was immediately greeted by Stefan, who rushed out to greet him before he entered the workshop proper. "Santa, I'm sorry. I tried it just took over." Nicholas was confused by Stefan's urgent and nervous tone, and only upon entering his workshop did he fully understand. It seemed that during Nicholas's absence, their guest had decided to make themselves at home. The first thing Nicholas noticed was the hellhound, which was currently mingling and getting to know the magical wolverines that existed in the vicinity of the workshop. Usually reclusive, the larger-than-normal canines have been drawn in by the strange presence of the demon dog, and funnily enough, the two species of supernatural creatures seemed to be getting along well, even playing and roughhousing in the snowy courtyard outside the main workshop. The stark white fur of the creatures was in deep contrast to the jet black and fiery hide that the hellhound possessed, and that was just the tip of the iceberg when comparing their physical differences. Despite all of this, however, Nicholas was relatively unperturbed until he stepped through the large doors that marked the entrance to the toy-making facility. Vega, in his ever-present desire to assist, had seen fit to revolutionize Nicholas's entire operation. There, on a massive screen that constituted the main announcement board above the workbenches and machines, Vega had awed the elves with figures and statistics that promised to double or even triple their outputs with almost half the materials. As a result, the entire workshop was now unrecognizable, as Vega's ideas had been taken immediately to heart by the elves, and they had enthusiastically rearranged the layout of the floor and had also begun work on new tools and fabrication methods that promised far greater quality of toys and gifts. "I try to speak up," Stefan said, an uncharacteristic nervousness seeping into the voice of Nicholas's second-in-command. But I must admit that he had some pretty good ideas. Nicholas had not yet spoken, for even he felt a bit sheepish at what Vega had accomplished in such a short amount of time. The AI was certainly practical, if nothing else, and Nicholas was quickly given an opportunity to thank him as Vega suddenly spoke up from speaker nearby. "Hello, St. Nicholas. I trust your delivery route was a success." "Indeed, it was, Vega," Nicholas said good-naturedly, his gaze wandering over the elves as they all excitedly continued with their upgrades. "Though it seems that I was not the only one that was busy last night. It is my hope that you do not think I coerced your workforce into the changes you see before you," Vega replied, his voice remaining as pleasant as it always had been. "I merely offered suggestions to improve the already extremely efficient operations that are conducted here. The elves saw fit to implement them right away with the notion that you would approve." "Did they now?" Nicholas said, raising an eyebrow down to Stefan, who avoided his gaze and suddenly became very interested in a spot on the floor. "I have also drafted a few designs for future expansion and products, to be reviewed at your leisure, St. Nicholas." Nicholas was nearly overwhelmed by Vega's generosity. Thankfully, he was saved by something he noticed while watching the elves eagerly work. "It seems a large portion of my workforce is not here," he noted curiously. "They are currently with the Doom Slayer, who is working at bench 137. Vega replied cordially before Stefan could speak up. This also piqued Nicholas's curiosity, as he'd only borne witness to the Slayer's combative abilities, and if his capacity to create was on par with his capacity to destroy. A trip to bench 137 showed a large crowd of elves gathered around the workbench, their short stature easily revealing the few Yeti that were also gathered around, and that of the Slayer himself. Working intently, the Slayers seemed to be designing a compact device of sorts, and for what Nicholas could see, he deduced that it was some sort of bladed weapon designed to deploy and retract upon command. The device was currently sheathed within its housing, and the Slayer was tightening a few miniature screws on the device itself. All parties present held their breath as the Slayer finished up, and with the flick of a small switch on the housing itself, the blade sprung forth with a metallic hiss, locking into place and extending about a foot beyond the sheath. While the device itself was relatively simple, Nicholas's trained eye told him that the blade was incredibly heavy and dense for its size, which meant that the interior design was quite intricate given how small the housing of the blade actually was. The portions of the blade that collapsed to allow it to fit into its sheath were also seamless, flawless even. And it was only thanks to Nicholas's millennia of experience crafting such weapons that he could tell where one segment ended and another began. The elves gasped and looked to one another excitedly at such a fine display of craftsmanship. And though Nicholas could still see a few design flaws that would need to be corrected if the blade were to be utilized in serious combat, a look at the Doomslayer showed that he was aware of those flaws as well. Though the armored man seemed to be only tinkering around with an idea of his rather than seriously attempting to fashion the blade for immediate use. While the Slayer examined the blade thoughtfully, Nicholas took the opportunity to approach. "Your work is commendable, Slayer," Nicholas said. It was a small suggestion, and though Nicholas was certain that the armored human would have come to the same conclusion given time, Nicholas felt that he would still offer it nonetheless. The Doomslayer seemed to take Nicholas's suggestion into consideration, and he gave a small nod with his head in thanks. "Now," Nicholas said with finality, "I'm sure you're wondering as to why I have asked you to remain with us for just a little bit longer. Or perhaps you figured it out already. I initially did not understand why you requested that we remain in this dimension, Saint Nicholas," Vega confirmed from where he was listening. "But I believe I understand your intentions now." The Doomslayer said nothing, but he pulled out the small scroll they had recovered from Krampus's workshop and held it easily, standing up from the workbench as he did so. Wordlessly, the Juggernaut passed the scroll to Nicholas, his movements indicating that he regarded the scroll, and by extension the weapon described within, with great reverence. "Indeed," Nicholas said, turning and leading the way to his private office, where his own specialized workbench sat. Each of the workstations in the main production floor possessed high-quality tools and equipment for whatever fabrication technique the elves required, but Nicholas's bench was the pinnacle of pinnacles when it came to crafting. Tools of legendary status had been acquired and added to his collection over the years, and slowly, the bench had been modified to Nicholas's exact specifications for when he needed to test experimental toys or crafts. Even to an untrained eye, one would immediately know that there existed no finer place on the planet for crafting and building if they laid eyes on it. In addition, much of Nicholas's magic had been infused with his personal tools, enhancing them many times over and making the quality of his creations unparalleled throughout the planet. Nicholas was never prideful to the point of being arrogant, but he knew that even though the Slayer had visited multiple realms and worlds throughout his quest, he would be hard-pressed to find anyone more fit to smith this weapon. Together, with the Slayer's knowledge and Vega's keen eye, Nicholas selected only the most robust materials and set about his work, beginning to shape and craft the weapon with a practiced eye that had been honed through thousands of years of smithing and forging. The process described in the scroll utilized similar smithing techniques to those that Nicholas knew, and the Doomslayer was fortunate that they had discovered the scroll here, as there were not many on this planet that were proficient enough to utilize them, and even fewer that could consider themselves a master in such arts. Slowly, the weapon was given form, and after a few hours of meticulous and precise work, Nicholas picked up the weapon and inspected it with the eye of a master smith. He looked for any inconsistencies or flaws in the object that he held in his hand, and despite his supernatural attention to detail, he could find not a single blemish along the metal object he had created with the help of his guests. Wordlessly, Nicholas held the small object out to the Slayer, who inspected it as well, his eye likely no worse than Nicholas's in his analysis. After a few moments, the Doomslayer looked back to Nicholas and gave a resolute nod with his head, communicating his approval of Nicholas's work. "Your crafting technique and precision is superb, Saint Nicholas," Vega said politely, his compliment bringing a small smile to his face. "There are few other beings that I am aware of that would be even remotely capable of replicating the quality of work you just displayed." "Don't butter me up just yet, Vega," Nicholas said with a chuckle. "We still have a few very important steps to complete." Turning back to the Doomslayer, Nicholas held the object out in one hand such that there was room for the Slayer to grab hold of it as well. Instructing him to concentrate his will, Nicholas closed his eyes and did the same. Honing his power, Nicholas felt his magic surge and channel into the object, flowing quickly and easily into the metal and imbuing it with power. At the same time, Nicholas reached out to the Slayer's personal aura through the medium of the object, politely coaxing it out with the armored figure's concurrence and mixing it with his own inside the object itself. Nicholas had said before that the Slayer, being not of this world, was incompatible with the magic that flowed throughout it, and while that was still true, there were still ways for his life force to interact and alter the reality around him. And through this weapon, Nicholas was able to act as a catalyst for them both to imbue the weapon with their energy. Their combined might filled the object in a matter of seconds, but Nicholas furrowed his brow and willed even more energy into the object, condensing the power and allowing more and more to funnel in. A small whirlwind began to blow within Nicholas's private workshop, and the lights around them flickered from the interference generated by both of their power. Despite this, Nicholas kept his focus and forced even more magic into the weapon, drawing upon the reserves he had gained the night before upon Krampus's defeat. A few moments more, and Nicholas released, sealing the power imbued by both him and the Doomslayer into the weapon and opening his eyes at last. There was a metallic impact, and a low hum pulsed throughout the room for the briefest moments before dissipating. With a slightly winded motion, Nicholas released his grip on the weapon, allowing the Slayer to take full control of it for the first time. As the armored man inspected it once more, Nicholas took notice of the fact that a portion of the object was now glowing a vibrant red. More specifically, it was the symbol that Nicholas had carefully emulated from the depiction of the weapon found in the scroll, the same symbol that was displayed on the upper brow of the Slayer's helm. In addition, two metallic portions of the weapon had opened wide from their original upright positions, thrusting outward and giving it a resemblance to the letter T. As he took in the sight, Nicholas thought back to the last weapon that he had fed that much of his power to, and his eyes drifted to Rudolph, which was displayed above the workbench on the wall of his private office. Though the weapon had quieted and gone dormant after Krampus's defeat, Nicholas could feel the axe stir even from where he stood a few meters away. It had been slightly awakened by the creation of another powerful weapon, and Nicholas heard it hum anticipatedly as it curiously felled out the combination of Nicholas's and the Slayer's power that permeated the design. Nicholas soothed the axe with his magic, slowly coaxing it back to its dormant state. Though as the axe quieted, Nicholas turned back to the Doom Slayer and spoke intently about the weapon they had just created. "I'm sure you are aware," Nicholas began, "but that weapon has been imbued with a substantial amount of both of our power. So much, in fact, that it no doubt has been given a will of its own." Nicholas could feel it, even almost see it in the air. The weapon was alive, and it was incredibly powerful, more so than even Rudolph had been upon its creation. As a result, its level of consciousness was undoubtedly higher than its predecessor, and in this territory, Nicholas was woefully unfamiliar. Never before had so much of his magical power been fused into a weapon, and though Nicholas was confident that the Doomslayer was capable of keeping control over such a potent device, it still gave Nicholas the smallest feeling of apprehension of what they had created. "I am indeed aware of the aura that flows throughout this object," Vega replied. "I'm also greatly intrigued by it, as its life force, while similar to that of yourself and the Doomslayer, has taken on a unique signature of its own. And it will continue to do so," Nicholas confirmed with a nod. "Its consciousness will be rudimentary in comparison to us, but it is still powerful and will continue to shape itself as it continues to exist." "Intriguing," Vega replied. There was a pause in the next moment, and though it was brief, Nicholas could not help but feel some sort of unspoken charge in the air, leading him to believe that there was more to this topic than he was aware of. The moment passed quickly, however, and Nicholas offered the Slayer a small smile before beckoning him to follow as he exited his workshop. "Well then, Slayer, how about we place the finishing touches on that weapon? After all, what use is a hilt without a blade?" Nicholas returned to the main workshop to see Stefan and the others just finishing up. Per Nicholas's instructions, they had constructed a large basin in the center of the room, the dimensions of which were about 1 meter in diameter and half as deep. The basin, crafted with the most robust of metals, was filled nearly to the brim with bright red molten energy, courtesy of Nicholas himself. Very seldom was Nicholas's magic required to be purified into a form such as this, as distilling the power into a liquid form only degraded any weapon that was inserted into it. The physical form of the weapon clashed with the physical form of the energy, decaying it rapidly. It was because of this that Nicholas imbued his tools and weapons with his magic directly, like he had just done so for the Doomslayer's new weapon. If the weapon was constituted solely of energy, however, just in time, Santa, Stefan reported, gesturing to the lava-like energy that simmered within the basin. "We are ready." Nicholas gave a thankful nod to his comrade, then stepped aside as the Doomslayer strode forward, already knowing what came next. "Whenever you are ready." The Slayer gave a nod of his own to Nicholas, then gave a sweep of the room with his helmeted gaze. The entire elfish workforce had gathered to see this moment, the Yeti and the Hellhound arriving to witness the spectacle as well, the latter having concluded its meeting with the Arctic wolves outside. The Slayer stepped forward to the basin, and without hesitation, the armored man inserted the upper portion of the weapon into the molten energy, the liquid power immediately reacting and arcing upward onto the hilt with small bolts of red lightning. The Slayer held the hilt steady for a moment as the energy writhed and thrashed, then slowly lifted it upward and out of the basin. As he did so, however, much of the molten energy followed, solidifying and taking the form of a large red blade that protruded from the end of the hilt. The blade itself was composed entirely of energy, and as the Slayer removed it further, Nicholas could see numerous symbols etched upon the hardened light. Some of the symbols were like those depicted on the scrolls they had seen on that night. These symbols still meant nothing to Nicholas, but his eyes widened when he saw a few symbols he did recognize. Some of the ancient runes that Nicholas had first used to facilitate his magical power were displayed as prominently as the others. And indeed, many of these runes could also be seen on Rudolph's axe blade, their presence an indicator that Nicholas's power flowed through the blade, as well as the Slayer's. A few lingering arcs of lightning jumped from the base into the blade as the Slayer removed it completely, and a collective gasp went through the crowd of gathered elves and Yeti as he held it high for all to see. Even Nicholas himself marveled at the blade, his own craftsmanship perfectly acting as a vessel to shape and give life to the combined energy that constituted this new weapon. Faint whispers reached his ears as his magic spoke to him again, uttering one word in reverence of the powerful device that the Slayer held in his hands. Crucible. It took less than a day for Nicholas to review the ideas and potential blueprints that Vega had left him, and less than a week for the elves to implement almost all of them into the day-to-day operations in the workshop. As a result, the shop was running with unrivaled efficiency by New Year's Day, and Nicholas allowed himself a small chuckle and a shake of his head as he tinkered on his workbench, his elves already well ahead of schedule for next Christmas's workload. The Doomslayer, Vega, and the Hellhound had all departed in a flash of blue light shortly after thanking Nicholas for his help, though the Father of Christmas insisted that he should have been the one thanking them. They had helped save not only Christmas on that night, but all Christmases to come, as Krampus's victory would have been all but assured without their timely arrival. It was for that reason that Nicholas was grateful that he had been given the opportunity to give a gift to the Doomslayer in the spirit of the season, and though Nicholas had prepared something for Vega as well, the AI politely refused his gift, insisting ever so kindly that the knowledge of his workshop and crafting tactics was more than sufficient, as the AI seemed to hold knowledge in high esteem above a great many things. The Hellhound, in contrast, eagerly accepted the gift Nicholas offered to it, which came in the form of spiced meats and food from his pantries. As with the Yeti, the demonic canine took quite a liking to the exquisite sustenance, the premium choices obviously satisfying the creature's palate. And it was with a full belly and fresh armament that the trio departed, but not without the Doomslayer providing Nicholas with one final gift of his own. That gift was now standing proudly on the corner of Nicholas's desk, and it took the form of a toy version of the Doomslayer, which sported slightly more cartoonish proportions in the form of a slightly larger head atop the body. The colors of the toy differed slightly from the armor they were based upon, with the most obvious differences being that the helmet and visor possessed a darker gray color instead of green. Despite that, Nicholas looked at the toy rather fondly, knowing that the gift would always serve as a reminder of what transpired that fateful Christmas. It also served as a warning of sorts, a warning to always stand ready should a threat like this arise again. Krampus may have been defeated, but as sure as the North Pole was cold, another would arise to eventually take his place. It might be centuries before such an evil arose again, but it would still come all the same. And yet, Nicholas did not fear its arrival. For some reason, the Slayer toy instilled in him the will to stand against Krampus should he ever arise again. And though Nicholas may never be as strong or as powerful as the Doomslayer, he knew that if Krampus ever returned, he would be there, ready to protect humanity once more. Off the note, boom. There it is, folks. After over 4 years, this story finally has its very own holiday special. I don't really count the Jack Reacher chapter at this point due to the lack of a holiday-based issue for our friends to solve. So I will mark this as the first one. Embarrassing as this is to admit, I actually began writing this chapter over a year ago, but didn't finish it until now. Oh well, better late than never. I also must admit, when I was thinking of how to depict Santa in this chapter, I found myself heavily drawn to how he looks in A Christmas Horror Story. It was really his battle in the movie that sealed the deal for me, though I encourage everyone to stick to however they had imagined him as they read through this chapter. With that in mind, please do not hesitate to let me know how you thought of this chapter, whether it be the tone, pacing, characterization, the incredibly large exposition bomb at the end. All good and bad thoughts are welcome. Until next time, ImpulsiveWeaver, Universal Dome. Chapter 39, Borderlands. Vega immediately noted upon their arrival in this new dimension that the current gravity was negligible. It seemed that this time, the tether system had chosen to deposit both the Slayer and the Hellhound in the vast vacuum of space, as it had done so many times before. As the Hellhound spun freely and attempted to cease its motion, Vega turned the sensors of the Praetor's suit to the starry ambience, scanning or any possible match to determine their current location. His results were inconclusive, even with the vast expanse of star charts he himself had generated from their multiple visits to alternate dimensions and universes. As a result, Vega concluded that they had not arrived in any region of space that could be considered an alternate version of a universe they'd visited before, and his hypothesis was proven correct as he noted the closest celestial body to their current location was a planet, though it was over 400,000 kilometers away. From what Vega could discern from visual scans alone, he could see that the planet possessed quite a few different climate zones, and a few other scans returned to find that life most likely existed upon its surface. Further examination discovered that a single moon remained in close orbit to the planet itself, and despite the distance from the moon, Vega could tell based on its orbital path that it was relatively small compared to the moon of the Earth that he and the Slayer originated from. Even further still, Vega noted with curiosity that a large space station sat in orbit of the moon itself, the man-made structure taking the shape of a large H from what Vega could see. Despite all that Vega was able to discern about the planet and its moon, he was still unable to perform any deeper scans beyond what he could visually see, meaning that if there were anything unnatural occurring on its surface, he would never know. Attempting to reach the planet in a timely fashion in order to more thoroughly examine, it was impossible without some kind of outside assistance, as the fastest method they could utilize would be the Slayer firing one of his weapons continuously in the direction opposite to the planet, which would effectively case him to build up speed until he entered the planet's atmosphere. Running calculations at a speed that only Vega was capable, the AI deduced that to achieve the fastest results, the Gauss cannon would be the weapon of choice. Though even if the Slayer continuously fired the weapon up until the point he entered the planet's atmosphere, the duration of the journey would still approximate to almost a week of travel. Running risk calculations next, Vega weighed the possibility of the planet undergoing some form of calamity that would require the Slayer's assistance against the time it would take to arrive, and despite running numerous scenarios and trials, the AI continued to arrive at the conclusion that the time they would lose did not merit further investigation of the world. It was with that Vega finally spoke to the Doomed Slayer, who was also investigating the faraway planet. The planet you see before you is approximately 432,512 kilometers away. Though I am unable to accurately investigate for anomalies, it is my belief that we move on to the next dimension, as the amount of time required to journey close and accurately scan the world decreases the possibility of arriving in another dimension in time to render aid before it is too late. The Slayer considered Vega's words, then nodded once in agreement, gesturing to the Hellhound as he did so. The Hound immediately understood and warped close enough for the Slayer to make contact with its fur, and as soon as the armored man grabbed hold, he raised his right gauntlet and activated the tether. There was a flash of blue light, but there was no loud bang due to the vacuum of space. In total, the trio spent less than 1 minute in the dimension before warping away, never to return. Never. Author note, and scene. Phew. At long last, the long-awaited Borderlands chapter is here. I know you guys were super excited for this one, and I can only hope that I delivered everything you asked for and more. Be sure to leave me a review letting me know what your favorite/most hated part of the chapter was, as I always look forward to hearing from you all. Until next time, okay, I'm sorry, but I really couldn't resist having a little fun with this one. For those who stuck around this far and haven't sent me death threats yet, this chapter is not canon. I repeat, not canon to Universal Doom, and is only a joke chapter. The real Borderlands chapter exists in the form of its own story titled Hell in a Box, so please go and read that before you track my IP and strangle me. ImpulsiveWeaver.